The mahogany grandfather clock in Margaret Williams's study chimed 11 times, its deep resonance echoing through the silence of her Malibu mansion like a funeral bell. At 72, Margaret sat behind the same oak desk where she and her late husband Robert had built their real estate empire from nothing, her manicured fingers tracing the worn leather inlay that had witnessed 50 years of million-dollar decisions. The familiar scent of jasmine drifted through the open French doors, carried on the cool Pacific breeze that had once brought her such peace. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, the weight of suspicion sat heavy in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow. She stared at the family photo on her desk, taken just last Christmas at their annual gathering in this very room. There she was, surrounded by her 3 children and granddaughter, everyone smiling for the camera with practiced perfection. But as Margaret looked closer, studying each face with the analytical eye that had made her billions, she noticed something that made her heart sink. Everyone was looking at the camera, except her family was looking past her, towards something else. Something more interesting than the woman who had given them everything. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid," she whispered to herself, adjusting her reading glasses with trembling fingers. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the lamplight, throwing tiny rainbows across the mahogany surface, a gift from Robert on their 40th anniversary, back when she still believed that love and generosity were enough to guarantee loyalty. But then she remembered what had happened earlier that day, and the stone in her chest grew heavier. Margaret had been in the kitchen around noon, her silk blouse protected by her favorite apron as she prepared her famous apple pie for Sunday dinner. The familiar ritual of measuring flour and cutting butter had always calmed her nerves, the sweet aroma of cinnamon and vanilla filling the air like a warm embrace. She was humming softly to herself, lost in memories of teaching Emma this same recipe years ago, when her son Richard's voice carried through the thin walls of the breakfast nook. His tone was casual, almost conversational, but the words hit Margaret like physical blows. "Listen, Mom's getting older," Richard had said, his voice carrying that particular inflection he used when discussing business problems that needed solving. "She's 72 now. How much longer can she really run a company this size? I mean, at some point, we need to start thinking about transitions." Margaret had frozen, her hands covered in flour, the wooden spoon suspended halfway to the mixing bowl. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm, the familiar scents now cloying and overwhelming. She pressed her back against the cool granite countertop, straining to hear every word of the conversation that was reshaping her understanding of her own family. No, she's still sharp," Richard continued, and Margaret could hear him pacing, a habit he'd inherited from his father, though Robert had paced when he was excited about new opportunities, not when he was plotting someone's downfall. "But you know how it is with people her age. Things can change overnight. One day they're fine, the next day they can't remember where they put their keys. We just need to be prepared." The conversation had lasted another 10 minutes, with Richard discussing contingency plans and power of attorney like he was planning a hostile takeover, not talking about his mother's future. Margaret had stood frozen in her own kitchen, listening to her firstborn son reduce her to a business problem that needed managing, a liability that required mitigation. Now, hours later, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that had settled in her stomach like poison. She opened her laptop, the same device Richard probably assumed she barely knew how to use, and began scrolling through her emails with the methodical precision that had built her empire. What she found in her family's digital correspondence made her blood run cold. There was an email thread between Richard and Marcus, her middle son, with the subject line, "Mom's financial situation, confidential." The timestamp showed it had been sent just 3 days ago while she was upstairs reading, trusting her children to respect her privacy and her autonomy. Margaret's hands trembled as she read, each word feeling like a betrayal carved in digital stone. "Richard, I've been thinking about what we discussed. Mom's been making some questionable investment decisions lately. Did you see she donated $50,000 to that animal shelter last month? That's not like her. Maybe we should start documenting these things, just in case we need to show a pattern later. Marcus." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The donation to the animal shelter hadn't been impulsive or questionable. It had been carefully considered, a gift to an organization that rescued senior dogs, animals that reminded her of herself in their vulnerability and need for compassion. But Marcus had twisted her generosity into evidence of mental decline. The response was even worse. "Good point. I'll start keeping track. Also, Jessica mentioned Mom forgot about their lunch date twice this month. We should probably start a log of these incidents. Better safe than sorry." Richard. Margaret's mind raced back to those lunch dates. She hadn't forgotten them. She had deliberately avoided them because Jessica only called when she needed money, and Margaret was tired of being treated like a personal ATM. But now her attempts to set boundaries were being documented as signs of cognitive failure. But what hurt most was the next email in the thread, sent just yesterday. "By the way, has anyone talked to Emma about this? She spends the most time with Mom. We might need her on board if things get complicated. Marcus. I'll handle Emma. She's young and idealistic, but she'll understand this is for Mom's own good. Richard." Margaret closed the laptop with shaking hands and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below with relentless fury, and for a moment she felt just as battered, just as powerless against forces beyond her control. Emma. Her 28-year-old granddaughter, Richard's daughter from his first marriage, to a woman who had actually loved him before she discovered his capacity for selfishness. Emma was the light of Margaret's life, the only one who called just to say hello, who remembered Margaret's birthday without a Facebook reminder, who listened to stories about the old days with genuine interest rather than barely concealed impatience. Emma was the one person in the family who seemed to love Margaret for who she was, not what she owned. Were they planning to manipulate Emma too? To turn her own granddaughter against her? Margaret's reflection stared back at her from the window. Silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. Blue eyes still sharp and intelligent behind designer frames, wearing the pearl necklace Robert had given her on their 40th anniversary. She looked like what she was, a successful, powerful woman who had built an empire through intelligence, determination, and an uncanny ability to read people's true motivations. But apparently, to her children, she looked like something else entirely. A problem to be managed, an obstacle to be removed. A confused old woman whose generosity was a symptom of mental illness rather than a reflection of her values. "Well," Margaret said to her reflection, her voice gaining strength with each word, "if they want to see how I handle being old and vulnerable, maybe it's time I showed them exactly what a vulnerable old woman is capable of." She walked back to her desk with renewed purpose, her silk slippers silent on the marble floor. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as she picked up her phone, the sound marking not just the end of one day, but the beginning of something entirely new. There was one person she could trust completely, someone who had been with her family for over 20 years and had seen them at their best and worst. "Dr. Sarah? It's Margaret Williams. I know it's late, but I need to see you tomorrow. It's urgent." Dr. Sarah Chen had been the Williams family physician since Emma was 8 years old, back when scraped knees and childhood fevers were the family's biggest medical concerns. She was one of the few people who knew Margaret not as a billionaire real estate mogul, but as a woman who had worked 16-hour days to build something meaningful, who had nursed Robert through his final illness with unwavering devotion, who had raised 3 children while running a company and never missed a school play or soccer game. "Of course, Margaret. Is everything all right? You sound upset, Doctor." Sarah's voice carried the gentle concern that had comforted the Williams family through decades of medical crises. But Margaret could hear the worry underneath. Margaret looked at the family photo again, seeing it now with new eyes, not a portrait of love and unity, but evidence of a carefully constructed facade that was finally cracking. "I need to ask you about something very specific. Something that might sound unusual. I'm listening. What do you know about early-stage Alzheimer's? How it presents, how it progresses, how someone might appear to family members in the beginning stages?" There was a pause, and Margaret could almost hear Dr. Sarah's medical training kicking in, running through differential diagnoses and treatment protocols. Margaret, are you experiencing symptoms? Memory issues? Confusion? Difficulty with familiar tasks? No, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. But I need to understand what it would look like if I were. I need to understand it well enough to convince people who think they know me better than I know myself. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. Why don't you come in tomorrow morning? We'll talk. And Margaret, whatever's happening, whatever you're thinking of doing, please be careful. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her study for another hour, thinking with the strategic mind that had outmaneuvered countless business rivals and turned a small real estate office into a billion-dollar empire. She thought about Robert, who had always told her that people's true character only showed when they thought no one was watching. She thought about the company they had built together, now worth over $2 billion and employing thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on wise leadership. She thought about the children she had raised, the values she thought she had instilled in them, the legacy she had assumed would be safe in their hands. And she thought about Emma, sweet Emma, who still brought her homemade cookies and stayed for dinner every Sunday, who listened to Margaret's stories about building the business and actually seemed interested, who had never once asked about her inheritance or suggested that Margaret was too old to make her own decisions. If Margaret was going to test her family's love, she needed to be smart about it. She needed to create a situation where they would reveal their true intentions, where the mask of filial duty would slip and show what lay beneath. She needed to become exactly what they apparently expected her to become: vulnerable, confused, dependent, and see who would protect her and who would exploit her. Early-stage Alzheimer's was perfect. It was believable for someone her age, affecting 1 in 9 people over 65. It would make her appear vulnerable, but not immediately incapacitated, creating a window where she could observe their behavior while still maintaining some control. It would create urgency around financial decisions, forcing them to show their true priorities, and most importantly, it would show her exactly who would stand by her when she needed them most, and who would see her condition as an opportunity to finally get what they'd been waiting for. Margaret opened her laptop again and began researching with the thoroughness that had made her fortune. She read medical journals, watched documentaries, studied the progression of the disease with the same intensity she had once applied to market analysis and investment strategies. She learned about the early symptoms: mild memory loss, confusion about time and place, difficulty completing familiar tasks, problems with language, misplacing things, decreased judgment, withdrawal from social activities. She could fake all of it. More importantly, she could fake it convincingly enough to fool her children, who had apparently already decided she was losing her mind anyway. By 3 a.m, she had a plan that was both elegant and devastating in its simplicity. She would give her family exactly what they expected: a confused, vulnerable elderly woman who needed their protection and guidance. And in return, they would show her exactly who they really were. Margaret Williams had built an empire by being smarter than everyone else in the room, by seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles, by understanding that information was the most valuable currency of all. Now she was about to use that intelligence to uncover the truth about the people she loved most. The test was about to begin, and by the end of it, she would know exactly who her real family was. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Margaret finally went to bed, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she lay in the king-sized bed she had shared with Robert for 43 years, staring at the ceiling and preparing for the performance of her lifetime. Tomorrow she would begin the most important role she had ever played, that of a woman losing her mind. But in reality, she had never been more focused, more determined, or more dangerous than she was at this moment. Her children thought they were waiting for her to become vulnerable so they could take advantage of her. They had no idea that the vulnerable old woman they were about to meet was actually a brilliant strategist who was about to turn their own greed against them. The morning sun rose over Malibu, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, as Margaret Williams prepared to discover the truth about her family. It was going to be a beautiful day for justice. Doctor. Sarah Chen's medical office in Beverly Hills was exactly what you'd expect for a physician who treated Hollywood's elite and business moguls. Understated luxury with cream-colored walls, expensive artwork that whispered rather than shouted wealth, and the kind of profound quiet that money could buy. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in a soft, golden glow that should have been comforting but somehow felt ominous. Margaret sat in the familiar leather chair across from Dr. Sarah's mahogany desk, her hands folded in her lap with the practiced composure of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms. She was wearing one of her best Chanel suits, navy blue with pearl buttons, the kind of outfit that commanded respect and attention. But today, she felt like she was wearing armor for a battle she had never wanted to fight. "Margaret, Dr. Sarah began, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided the Williams family through medical crises for over 2 decades. "Tell me what's really going on. Your call last night. You sounded different. Upset in a way I've never heard before." Margaret had rehearsed this conversation in her mind a dozen times during the sleepless night, but now, facing her longtime friend and physician, she felt the weight of what she was about to ask. The morning coffee she'd had earlier sat like acid in her stomach, and her hands trembled slightly despite her efforts to maintain control. "Sarah, I need your help with something that's going to sound unconventional. Something that goes against everything we've both believed about honesty and trust." Dr. Sarah leaned forward, her dark eyes focused intently on Margaret's face with the laser-sharp attention that had made her one of the most respected physicians in Los Angeles. "I'm listening. And Margaret, whatever it is, you know you can trust me. I have reason to believe that my children are waiting for me to become incapacitated so they can take control of my assets." Margaret's voice was steady, but Dr. Sarah could hear the pain underneath, the kind of deep hurt that came from betrayal by the people you loved most. "I found emails, Sarah. They're documenting my behavior, looking for signs of cognitive decline, building a case against my competency like I'm some kind of hostile takeover target." Dr. Sarah's expression shifted from concern to something closer to anger, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Margaret, that's unconscionable. These are your children we're talking about. Are you absolutely certain?" Margaret pulled out her phone with hands that shook slightly, not from any medical condition, but from the sheer emotional weight of what she was revealing. She showed Dr. Sarah the email thread she had screenshotted, watching her friend's face grow darker with each line. "My God," Dr. Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your own children. They're treating you like a business problem to be solved." "I need to know the truth about who they really are," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "And I need to know if Emma, my granddaughter, is part of this conspiracy, or if she's the one person I can truly trust. Because if I can't trust Emma—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Dr. Sarah understood. Emma was Margaret's last hope for genuine family love, the final thread connecting her to the belief that blood meant something more than money. "Doctor." Sarah set down the phone and studied Margaret's face with the intensity of someone trying to read a complex medical chart. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I want to stage early-onset Alzheimer's. I want you to diagnose me with it, in front of my family. I want to see how they react when they think I'm becoming truly vulnerable, when they believe their window of opportunity is finally opening." The silence in the room stretched for nearly a minute, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on Dr. Sarah's bookshelf and the distant hum of Beverly Hills traffic. Dr. Sarah had been practicing medicine for 30 years, had seen every kind of family drama and medical crisis imaginable, but she had never been asked to participate in something like this. "Margaret, what you're asking me to do, it goes against everything I've sworn to uphold as a physician. I can't falsify medical records. I can't lie to your family about your health, the Hippocratic Oath, medical ethics, my license. Everything I've worked for could be destroyed." "I'm not asking you to falsify anything," Margaret said quickly, leaning forward with the intensity that had once intimidated corporate rivals. "I'm asking you to help me perform a test. Think of it as A psychological evaluation of my family's true intentions, a way to diagnose their character rather than my health. Dr. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palm trees lining Rodeo Drive, their fronds swaying gently in the morning breeze. The view was peaceful, serene, completely at odds with the moral complexity of what Margaret was proposing. This could destroy your family, Margaret. Are you prepared for what you might discover? Are you ready to learn that the people you love most in the world might not love you back the way you thought they did? My family is already being destroyed, Margaret replied, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had built an empire by facing hard truths. By greed, by impatience, by the assumption that I'm just an obstacle between them and their inheritance. I'd rather know the truth now, while I still have the power to do something about it, than discover it when I'm truly helpless. Dr. Sarah turned back to face her, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the conflict between medical ethics and human compassion, between professional obligations and personal loyalty. And if you're wrong? If they genuinely love you and are just concerned about your future, worried about what might happen if you do develop dementia or become incapacitated, then they'll prove it by how they treat me when they think I'm vulnerable. Love shows itself in action, Sarah, not in words. If they truly love me, they'll focus on my comfort, my dignity, my happiness. If they're just waiting for their inheritance, they'll focus on control, on legal documents, on managing my assets. After another long pause, Dr. Sarah returned to her desk, her decision made but her expression still troubled. If, and I mean if, I were to help you with this, it would have to be done very carefully. I won't create false medical records, but I could present symptoms in a way that suggests early cognitive decline. I could recommend tests, suggest monitoring, create a situation where your family believes you're in the early stages of dementia without actually lying about your condition. Margaret felt a surge of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. That's all I need. Just enough medical authority to make the situation believable. But Margaret, Dr. Sarah's voice was firm, carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions. This has to have an end date. I won't let this go on indefinitely. And the moment I feel this is causing you genuine harm, psychological, emotional, or otherwise, I'm pulling the plug. Your mental health is more important than any test. Agreed. I'm not looking to torture myself or anyone else. I just need to know the truth. Dr. Sarah opened her appointment book, her movements deliberate and careful. I want to see you again in 3 days. In the meantime, you're going to start exhibiting some subtle symptoms. Nothing dramatic, just small things. Forgetting names occasionally, misplacing items, maybe some confusion about dates or appointments. Can you do that convincingly? Margaret nodded, her mind already working through the performance she would need to give. I've been researching all night. I know what early-stage Alzheimer's looks like, how it progresses, what family members typically notice first. And Margaret? Dr. Sarah's voice softened, carrying the warmth of 2 decades of friendship. I hope you're wrong about your children. I really, truly hope that this test proves they love you exactly as much as you deserve to be loved. Margaret stood to leave, gathering her purse with hands that were steadier now that she had a plan, a purpose, a way forward. So do I, Sarah. But if I'm right, if they really are just waiting for me to become vulnerable so they can take everything Robert and I built, then they're about to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who's spent 50 years outmaneuvering people who thought they were smarter than her. As Margaret left the medical office and walked toward her car, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The die was cast, the plan was in motion, and soon she would know the truth about her family's love. The morning sun was warm on her face, the Beverly Hills streets bustling with the energy of people pursuing their dreams and ambitions. But Margaret Williams was about to embark on a different kind of pursuit, a hunt for truth that would either restore her faith in family or destroy it completely. Either way, she would finally know where she stood. The test was about to begin, and Margaret had never been more ready for anything in her life. 3 days later, Margaret sat in Dr. Sarah's office again, but this time she wasn't alone. The familiar waiting room had been transformed into a stage for the most important performance of her life. and her audience was already assembled. Richard sat to her right, his expensive Armani suit perfectly pressed, his Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He checked his phone every few minutes, with the impatience of a man who had more important places to be, his fingers drumming against his knee in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained energy. At 50, he had inherited his father's strong jawline and his mother's sharp intelligence, but there was something in his eyes that Robert had never possessed, a calculating coldness that made Margaret's skin crawl. Marcus was on her left, his nervous energy manifesting in the way he drummed his fingers impatiently on the arm of his chair, his wedding ring clicking against the leather with each tap. At 48, he had always been the middle child in every sense, caught between Richard's ambition and Jessica's charm, never quite finding his own identity. His thinning hair was carefully styled to hide the bald spot that had been growing for years, and his suit, while expensive, didn't quite fit properly around his expanding waistline. Jessica sat across from them, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like a shield, her perfectly manicured nails picking at the leather strap with barely concealed anxiety. At 45, she was still beautiful in the way that money could maintain: regular spa treatments, expensive skincare, and a personal trainer who kept her figure trim. But there were lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and dissatisfaction, and her smile had the brittle quality of something that might shatter at any moment. And then there was Emma, sitting closest to Margaret, holding her grandmother's hand with the gentle pressure of someone who genuinely cared. At 28, she had inherited the best features of the Williams family: her grandfather's kind eyes, her grandmother's strong cheekbones, and a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. She was wearing a simple blue dress that complemented her dark hair, and her concern was written across her face in lines of genuine worry. "Thank you all for coming, Doctor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the professional gravity that Margaret had heard her use when delivering serious diagnoses to other families over the years. "I asked Margaret to bring the family because we need to discuss some concerning developments that have emerged since our last appointment." Richard immediately put away his phone, his business instincts recognizing the shift in tone. "What kind of developments, Doctor?" "Doctor?" Sarah looked at Margaret, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, the signal they had agreed upon to begin the performance that would change everything. Over the past few weeks, Margaret has been experiencing some cognitive symptoms that are troubling. Memory lapses that go beyond normal aging, confusion about dates and times, difficulty with familiar tasks that she's performed thousands of times before. Emma squeezed Margaret's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Grandma, why didn't you tell me you were having problems? I've been with you almost every day, and you seemed fine." Margaret looked at Emma with what appeared to be confusion, her eyes slightly unfocused in the way she had practiced in front of her bedroom mirror. "Problems? What problems, dear? I'm sorry, remind me your name again?" The room went dead silent, the kind of profound quiet that follows a devastating revelation. Emma's face went white, her hand tightening on Margaret's as if she could somehow anchor her grandmother to reality through touch alone. "Grandma, it's me. It's Emma, your granddaughter, Richard's daughter." Margaret blinked several times, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and embarrassment in a carefully choreographed sequence. "Oh, of course. Emma. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I've been so tired lately, and sometimes things just slip away from me." "Doctor," Sarah continued, her voice steady but grave, "I've run several preliminary tests, and while we need to do more comprehensive evaluation, the symptoms Margaret is displaying are consistent with early-stage Alzheimer's disease." Jessica gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his drumming fingers suddenly still. Richard's face had gone completely pale, but Margaret caught something else in his expression, something that looked almost like relief, vindication, the look of someone who had been proven right about something he had suspected all along. "Alzheimer's?" Richard repeated, his voice carefully controlled. "Are you absolutely certain, Doctor?" We'll need to do more tests to confirm the diagnosis, Dr. Sarah explained. But the pattern of symptoms, the memory loss, the confusion, the difficulty with executive functions, it all points in that direction. The good news, if we can call it that, is that we've caught it early. Margaret is still functioning well in most areas of her life. Emma was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. But she seemed so normal most of the time. She was fine at dinner last Sunday. We cooked together. We talked about books. She helped me with my taxes. That's very typical of early-stage Alzheimer's, Dr. Sarah explained, her voice gentle but clinical. Patients can have good days and bad days, sometimes good hours and bad hours. They might seem completely normal for extended periods, then suddenly become confused or disoriented. The disease progresses differently for everyone. Margaret watched her family's faces carefully, cataloging every reaction, every expression, every tell that revealed their true thoughts. Emma was devastated, her tears genuine and heartbreaking, her focus entirely on Margaret's well-being and emotional state. But the others? Richard looked shocked, yes, but there was something else in his expression. Something that looked almost like calculation, like a chess player who had just seen his opponent make the move he had been hoping for. Marcus was asking practical questions, but they weren't about Margaret's comfort or care. How long do we have? How quickly does this progress? What's the timeline we're looking at? Jessica was focused on logistics rather than emotions. Will she need full-time care? Should we start looking into facilities? What about her living situation? But Emma was focused on Margaret herself, her questions coming from the heart rather than the head. Grandma, are you scared? What can we do to help you? How are you feeling about all this? The progression varies significantly from patient to patient, Dr. Sarah was saying, her words carefully chosen to provide information without creating false hope or unnecessary despair. Some people decline rapidly, others maintain their faculties for years. But Margaret will need increasing support and supervision as time goes on. Eventually, she'll need help with financial decisions, medical choices, daily activities. Richard and Marcus exchanged a look that Margaret caught, brief but unmistakable. It was the look of two people who had just heard exactly what they were hoping to hear, the confirmation of suspicions they had been harboring for months. "Doctor," Richard said, his voice carefully controlled and professional. "What kind of legal preparation should we be making? Power of attorney, medical directives, that sort of thing? I want to make sure we're prepared to help Mom when she needs it." "Those are important conversations to have," Dr. Sarah replied, "but I want to emphasize that Margaret is still competent to make her own decisions. This is about planning for the future, not taking away her autonomy now. She's still the same intelligent, capable woman she's always been." "Of course," Richard said quickly, but Margaret could hear the impatience in his voice. "I just want to make sure we're prepared to help Mom when she needs it. We don't want to wait until it's too late." Margaret looked around the room at her family, seeing them with new eyes. Emma was still holding her hand, still crying, still focused entirely on Margaret's emotional well-being. Jessica was already on her phone, probably Googling Alzheimer's care facilities and treatment options. Marcus was taking notes in a small notebook, documenting everything Dr. Sarah said with the thoroughness of someone building a case. And Richard was asking Dr. Sarah about timelines and legal requirements with the focused intensity of a businessman closing a deal. Only one person in that room was focused on Margaret's emotional well-being. Only one person seemed to care about how she was feeling rather than what this meant for the future. Only one person was treating her like a beloved family member rather than a problem to be managed. As they left the doctor's office, Emma walked beside Margaret while the others clustered together behind them, talking in low voices that carried just enough for Margaret to hear fragments of their conversation. "Need to move quickly on the power of attorney. If she gets worse suddenly, we could be locked out. Better safe than sorry." "Grandma," Emma said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that I'm going to be here for you. Whatever happens, whatever you need, I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this together." Margaret squeezed Emma's hand, and for a moment, she almost broke character. The love in her granddaughter's voice was so pure, so genuine, that Margaret felt a stab of guilt for the deception. But then she heard Richard behind them, talking to Marcus in a voice he thought was too low for her to hear. "We need to move quickly on the power of attorney. If she gets worse suddenly, we could be locked out of important decisions. The lawyer said we need to act while she's still competent enough to sign." And Margaret knew she was doing the right thing. The test had begun, and already the results were becoming clearer than she had ever wanted them to be. 2 weeks after the diagnosis, the Williams mansion had transformed into something resembling a medical facility, but one designed by someone who had never actually cared for a sick person. Richard had hired a part-time nurse, installed safety rails in the bathrooms that Margaret didn't need, and removed all the throw rugs that might cause her to trip, despite the fact that she had navigated those same rugs for 20 years without incident. To an outside observer, it looked like a family rallying around their matriarch in her time of need. But Margaret was watching everything with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent 50 years reading people in business negotiations, and what she saw was beginning to break her heart in ways she hadn't thought possible. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and overcast, the marine layer hanging low over Malibu like a shroud. Margaret was sitting in the sunroom, pretending to struggle with a crossword puzzle that she could have completed in her sleep, when she overheard Richard on the phone in the adjacent hallway. His voice carried through the thin walls with the clarity of someone who thought he was being discreet, but had never learned to truly lower his voice. "Yes, I understand the legal requirements," Richard was saying, his tone urgent but controlled, like a man trying to close a deal before his competition caught wind of it. "But you have to understand, my mother's condition is deteriorating more rapidly than we initially expected. We need to move on the power of attorney while she's still competent enough to sign." Margaret's pen froze over the crossword, the half-completed word betrayal mocking her from the page. She had been diagnosed just 2 weeks ago, and Richard was already pushing for legal control with the urgency of someone who saw opportunity slipping away. No, she's not that bad yet," Richard continued, and Margaret could hear him pacing, the same restless energy that had driven him to success in business, now focused on dismantling her autonomy. "But the doctor said it could progress quickly. I just want to make sure we're prepared." "What do you mean, suspicious timing? This is my mother's health we're talking about." There was a pause, and Margaret could imagine Richard's face, the expression he got when someone questioned his motives or suggested he might not have pure intentions. She had seen that look countless times in business meetings when competitors challenged his proposals. "Look," Richard's voice became sharper, more aggressive. "I'm paying you for legal advice, not moral judgments. Can you draft the documents or not?" Margaret carefully set down her pen and walked quietly toward the hallway, her silk slippers silent on the marble floor. She stayed just out of sight, pressing herself against the cool wall like a spy in her own home. "Fine," Richard was saying, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had gotten his way. "Have them ready by Friday. And make sure the language gives me full authority over all financial and medical decisions." "Yes, I understand she has to sign willingly." "She will." Margaret's blood ran cold, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid Richard might hear it. Full authority over all financial and medical decisions. 2 weeks after her diagnosis, and Richard was already planning to take complete control of her life, to reduce her to a signature on legal documents that would strip away every right she had fought 50 years to earn. She crept back to the sunroom and picked up her crossword, her hands shaking, not from any medical condition, but from rage and heartbreak so profound it felt like a physical illness. The word betrayal stared back at her, and she realized with bitter irony that she had been working on the wrong puzzle. The real puzzle was her family, and the picture emerging was uglier than anything she had imagined. That afternoon, Emma arrived for her usual visit, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing the bright smile that always lit up Margaret's day like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. She was dressed in jeans and a soft sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 28 years. "Hi, Grandma. I brought ingredients for your favorite soup. I thought we could cook together like we used to when I was little." Margaret looked up from her crossword with practiced confusion, letting her eyes unfocus slightly in the way she had perfected. Soup? What soup, dear? Emma's face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly, her smile becoming gentler, more patient. Your chicken and dumpling soup, the one you taught me to make when I was 12, remember? We made it together just last month when I was feeling sick. Margaret blinked several times, then smiled vaguely. Oh yes, that sounds nice. You're such a sweet girl. What was your name again? The pain that flashed across Emma's face was like a knife to Margaret's heart. But Emma didn't get frustrated or impatient. Instead, she knelt beside Margaret's chair and took her hands gently. I'm Emma, Grandma, your granddaughter, and I love you so much. As they worked in the kitchen, Emma chattering about her job at the art gallery and asking Margaret about her day with genuine interest, Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the time with her granddaughter despite the deception. Emma was patient when Margaret forgot ingredients, gentle when she confused the steps, and loving when Margaret seemed lost for a moment. The kitchen filled with the familiar aromas of chicken broth and fresh herbs, scents that carried Margaret back to happier times when cooking was about love rather than performance. Emma moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, knowing where everything was kept, comfortable in the space where she had spent countless hours learning from her grandmother. Grandma, Emma said, as they waited for the soup to simmer, her voice careful but determined. I've been thinking. Maybe I should move in here for a while. Just to help out, you know? I could take the guest room, and we could spend more time together. Margaret's heart swelled with love and guilt in equal measure. Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to do that. You have your own life, your own apartment, your career. You shouldn't have to take care of an old woman. You are my life, Emma said simply, her voice carrying the kind of truth that couldn't be faked or manufactured. You're the most important person in the world to me. I want to make sure you're okay, that you're happy, that you know you're loved. Before Margaret could respond, Richard walked into the kitchen, his face lighting up when he saw Emma with an expression that Margaret now recognized as calculated rather than genuine. Emma, perfect timing. I was hoping to talk to you. Emma looked up from stirring the soup, her expression wary in the way that suggested she had learned to be cautious around her father's sudden enthusiasms. What about Dad? Richard glanced at Margaret, then back at Emma, his eyes calculating. Maybe we could talk privately? In the study? It's about your grandmother's care, her future, adult conversations. Emma's jaw tightened, and Margaret could see the protective instincts flaring in her granddaughter's eyes. Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of Grandma. She's sitting right here, Dad. She can hear you. Emma, please, this is important. This is about making sure your grandmother gets the best possible care. Reluctantly, Emma followed Richard to the study, but not before squeezing Margaret's shoulder and whispering, I'll be right back, Grandma. Don't go anywhere. Margaret waited exactly 30 seconds, then quietly made her way to the hallway outside the study door, which Richard had left slightly ajar, a mistake that would prove costly. Emma, we need to talk about Mom's condition, Richard was saying, his voice taking on the tone he used when he was trying to convince someone to see things his way. What about it? Emma's voice was guarded, suspicious. It's progressing faster than we expected. The doctor thinks we need to start making some difficult decisions about her care, her future, her safety. Margaret frowned. Dr. Sarah had said no such thing. In fact, their last conversation had been about maintaining the fiction that Margaret's condition was stable for now. What kind of decisions? Emma's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who sensed manipulation. Legal decisions. Financial decisions. Mom needs someone to help her manage her affairs before she becomes completely incapacitated and can't make rational choices anymore. She seems fine most of the time, Emma protested, and Margaret could hear the confusion in her voice. A little forgetful, maybe, but she's still herself. She's still smart, still funny, still the grandmother I've always known. Emma, you're not seeing the whole picture because you don't want to see it, Richard said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Margaret's skin crawl. She forgot your name at the doctor's office. Yesterday she couldn't remember how to use the coffee maker. This morning I found her standing in the garden in her nightgown, completely confused about where she was. Margaret's eyes widened. That last part was a complete lie. She had been in the garden that morning, but fully dressed and perfectly oriented, checking on her roses and enjoying the morning air. Richard was fabricating symptoms to support his narrative. Even if that's true, Emma was saying, her voice growing stronger, it doesn't mean we should take away her independence. It doesn't mean we should treat her like a child who can't make her own decisions. I'm not talking about taking away anything, Richard said smoothly, his voice carrying the false sincerity of a practiced manipulator. I'm talking about protecting her, making sure she doesn't make decisions she'll regret later when her mind is clearer, making sure she doesn't hurt herself or others. Decisions like what? There was a pause, and Margaret could imagine Richard choosing his words carefully, crafting his argument to sound reasonable and caring. Well, for instance, last week she donated $50,000 to some animal shelter. $50,000, Emma. That's not like her. She's always been generous, but she's also always been careful with money, strategic about her giving. Maybe it is like her, Emma shot back, and Margaret felt a surge of pride at her granddaughter's defense. Maybe she wants to help animals. Since when is charity a sign of mental illness? Since when is generosity evidence of incompetence? It's not about the charity, Richard said, his patience clearly wearing thin. It's about the pattern, the poor judgment, the impulsive decisions. What if next time she decides to give away $1 million or $10 million? What if she falls for a scam or gets confused and signs something she doesn't understand? Margaret felt sick. Richard was twisting her act of generosity, something she had done because she genuinely cared about animal welfare, into evidence of mental incompetence. He was taking her values, her compassion, her desire to help others, and turning them into weapons against her. So what are you suggesting? Emma asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Power of attorney, medical and financial, just as a precaution, just to make sure someone can step in if she needs help. And who would have this power of attorney? Well, I'm the eldest son. I understand the business. I know her financial situation. It makes sense that... No. The single word hung in the air like a gunshot, sharp and final and uncompromising. Emma, be reasonable. No, Dad. If Grandma needs help with decisions, then we all help her. Together, as a family. We don't just hand over control of her entire life to one person, no matter who that person is. You're being naive, Emma. This isn't about family democracy. This is about legal reality. Someone needs to have the authority to make decisions quickly when necessary, to protect her interests. To what? To control her money? To decide where she lives? To choose her medical care? To determine who she can see and when she can see them? Richard's voice grew cold, and Margaret could hear the mask slipping. To protect her from herself. To protect her from making mistakes that could destroy everything she and your grandfather built. Margaret heard Emma's sharp intake of breath, and she could imagine her granddaughter's face. The shock, the disappointment, the growing understanding of what her father was really proposing. She's not a child, Dad. She's a brilliant woman who built an empire from nothing. Just because she's having some memory issues doesn't mean she's suddenly incompetent. It doesn't mean she's lost the right to live her own life. You don't understand the legal implications. I understand that you're talking about taking away her rights, Emma interrupted, her voice ringing with moral clarity. And I won't be part of it. I won't help you steal her autonomy and call it love. Margaret heard footsteps, then Emma's voice from the hallway. Grandma? Where are you? Margaret quickly made her way back to the sunroom, settling into her chair just as Emma appeared in the doorway. Her granddaughter's face was flushed with anger and distress, but she managed a smile when she saw Margaret. There you are, Emma said, her voice bright, but Margaret could see the tension in her shoulders. The soup's ready. Are you hungry? As they ate together, Emma chatting about everything except the conversation she'd just had with Richard, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions swirling through her chest. Pride in Emma for standing up for her, for refusing to be part of Richard's scheme. Heartbreak at Richard's willingness to lie about her condition, to fabricate symptoms, to twist her generosity into evidence of incompetence. And a growing certainty that this test was revealing exactly what she had feared it would. The people she had raised, the children she had loved and sacrificed for, were willing to steal her life from her. But the granddaughter she had helped raise, the young woman she had mentored and loved, was willing to fight for her rights even when it meant standing against her own father. That evening, after Emma had left and the house had grown quiet, Margaret sat in her study reviewing the day's events. She opened her laptop and began typing notes. A detailed record of everything she had observed, every conversation she had overheard, every lie that had been told. If this was going to be a test, she was going to document everything with the thoroughness that had made her fortune. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Dad told me about the power of attorney. Smart move. We should probably also look into updating her will while she's still competent. Just saying." Margaret stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over until the words burned themselves into her memory. Then she screenshotted it and added it to her growing file of evidence. The mask wasn't just slipping, it was falling away completely, revealing the ugly truth beneath. Her children weren't concerned about her welfare. They were concerned about their inheritance. They weren't trying to protect her. They were trying to protect their financial future. And they had no idea she was watching every moment of it, documenting every betrayal, building a case that would ultimately destroy them. The test was revealing exactly what she had feared, but it was also giving her exactly what she needed to fight back. 3 weeks into Margaret's diagnosis, the Williams family dynamics had shifted dramatically, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of what had once seemed like solid ground. What had once been a household where Margaret was the undisputed matriarch had become something else entirely. A place where her children moved with the careful calculation of people positioning themselves around a valuable asset that was slowly becoming available. Margaret watched it all from her new position as the confused family member who needed protection, and what she saw was breathtaking in its audacity and heartbreaking in its cruelty. The first major revelation came on a Thursday morning when the marine layer had lifted early, leaving the sky a brilliant blue that should have filled Margaret with joy. Instead, she was pretending to nap in the living room, having perfected the art of appearing asleep while remaining completely alert, a skill that was proving invaluable in her investigation of her family's true nature. Marcus had arrived early, which was unusual. He rarely visited unless it was a holiday or he needed something, and his presence at 9 a.m. set off alarm bells in Margaret's mind. She heard him talking quietly with Richard in the kitchen, their voices carrying the conspiratorial tone of people who thought they were being discreet. "I've been thinking about the Malibu property," Marcus was saying, his voice low but urgent, like a man discussing insider trading. "Mom's not using it anymore. She hasn't been to the beach house in months, even before the diagnosis. It's just sitting there, worth about $12 million, generating nothing but maintenance costs." Margaret's eyes snapped open behind her closed lids. The Malibu beach house was one of her most treasured possessions, the place where she and Robert had spent their honeymoon 43 years ago, where they had taken the children every summer for family vacations, where some of her happiest memories lived in every room, every sunset, every grain of sand. "What are you suggesting?" Richard replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who wanted to hear the proposal before committing to it. "I'm suggesting we sell it. Put the money into something more liquid, more manageable. Mom's not going to be taking beach vacations anymore, Richard. Let's be realistic about her future." Margaret felt like she'd been slapped. They were talking about selling her home, her memories, like it was just another stock in a portfolio, another asset to be optimized. "She's not dead, Marcus," Richard said, but his tone suggested he was considering the proposal rather than rejecting it. "No, but she's not going to get better either. And that property is just going to sit there while her medical bills pile up. Alzheimer's care is expensive, Richard. Really expensive. We need to start thinking about liquidating some assets to pay for her care." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. They were using her supposed illness as justification for dismantling everything she and Robert had built together, selling off pieces of her life to pay for care she didn't even need. "I don't know," Richard said slowly, and Margaret could hear the wheels turning in his mind. "It seems premature. She might have years left, and she might want to visit the beach house again." "Does it?" She forgot how to use the microwave yesterday. She called me Robert twice last week. How long do you think it'll be before she doesn't recognize any of us? Before she doesn't even remember that the beach house exists? That was another lie. Margaret had never called Marcus by her late husband's name, and she certainly knew how to use the microwave. But Marcus was building a narrative, creating a story of rapid decline that would justify increasingly drastic measures. "Look," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he had learned in business school. "I'm not saying we do it tomorrow, but we should start getting appraisals, talking to real estate agents, preparing the paperwork. By the time we actually need the money, everything will be in place." And what do we tell Mom? We tell her we're exploring options for her care. We tell her we want to make sure she has the best possible treatment, that we're being responsible with her assets. We don't tell her we're selling the place where she fell in love. Margaret had to bite her lip to keep from gasping. The casual cruelty of that statement, the acknowledgement that they knew exactly how much the property meant to her, and their decision to sell it anyway, was breathtaking in its callousness. "I'll make some calls," Richard said finally, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who had been convinced against his better judgment. Quietly, just to get an idea of the market. "Good. And Richard? We should probably think about the art collection too. Some of those pieces are worth millions, and they're just hanging on walls. Mom's not exactly hosting gallery showings anymore." After Marcus left, Margaret remained on the couch, processing what she had heard with the analytical mind that had built her empire. They weren't just planning to take control of her finances. They were planning to systematically dismantle everything she and Robert had built together, selling off their life piece by piece under the guise of caring for her. That afternoon, Jessica arrived for what she claimed was a family visit, but Margaret quickly realized it was actually a scouting mission. Jessica moved through the house with the practiced eye of someone appraising valuable items, her gaze lingering on paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects with an intensity that had nothing to do with aesthetic appreciation. "Mom, you have such beautiful jewelry," Jessica said, admiring the diamond necklace Margaret was wearing, a stunning piece that Robert had given her on their 25th anniversary. "Have you ever thought about putting some of it in a safety deposit box? You know, for security?" Margaret looked at her daughter with practiced confusion, letting her eyes drift slightly as if she was having trouble focusing. "Security? What do you mean, dear?" "Well, with your condition, you might forget where you put things. Expensive things. It would be terrible if something went missing, if someone took advantage of your confusion." Margaret touched the necklace, feeling the weight of the diamonds against her throat. "But I like wearing my jewelry. It makes me feel pretty, makes me remember your father." Jessica's smile was patient but strained, the kind of expression someone wore when dealing with a difficult child. "Of course, Mom. But maybe just the really valuable pieces? The ones you don't wear every day? I could help you organize them, make sure they're safe and properly cataloged." "That's very thoughtful of you, sweetheart. I was also thinking," Jessica continued, her voice taking on the casual tone of someone making a helpful suggestion, "about your closet. You have so many beautiful clothes, but some of them are, well, they're not really practical for someone in your situation. Maybe we could donate some of them? Make room for more comfortable things?" Margaret knew exactly what Jessica was really after. Her closet contained several vintage designer pieces that were worth small fortunes. Chanel suits from the 1960s that had appreciated dramatically, a Hermès collection that fashion museums would kill for, custom pieces from designers who were now legendary. Jessica was volunteering to help herself to a collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "I suppose that makes sense," Margaret said slowly, as if the idea was difficult for her to process. "But I'd want to keep my favorites, the ones that remind me of special times." "Of course. Just the things you never wear anymore. I could help you go through everything. Make sure we only donate the pieces that don't have sentimental value." Margaret nodded agreeably, while mentally noting that Jessica had just volunteered to be the sole arbiter of what had sentimental value, a decision that would undoubtedly favor Jessica's financial interests over Margaret's emotional attachments. The pattern was becoming clear with crystalline clarity. Each of her children was targeting different aspects of her wealth, like generals dividing up conquered territory. Richard wanted legal control and was focused on the big picture: power of attorney, estate management, institutional care. Marcus was after the real estate, the tangible assets that could be liquidated quickly. And Jessica was focused on the portable valuables: jewelry, art, designer clothes, things that could disappear without leaving much of a paper trail. They had divided up her empire like vultures circling a carcass, each claiming their preferred piece of the feast. But the most heartbreaking moment came that evening when Margaret overheard a three-way phone call between her children. She had gone upstairs early, claiming fatigue, but had actually positioned herself in the hallway where she could hear Richard's voice through his bedroom door. "I'm telling you, we need to move faster," Richard was saying, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who saw opportunity slipping away. "I talked to the lawyer again today. He says that once she's declared incompetent, any financial decision she makes can be challenged in court. But if we wait too long, and she gives away too much money before we get the power of attorney—" "How much has she given away so far?" Jessica's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp with concern. "50,000 to that animal shelter, 25,000 to some children's hospital. And yesterday I found out she wrote a check for 30,000 to Emma's art gallery. She's hemorrhaging money." Margaret frowned. She had indeed made those donations, but they were carefully considered gifts to causes she cared about. The animal shelter rescued senior dogs, animals that reminded her of herself in their vulnerability. The children's hospital had treated Emma when she was young. And the money to Emma's gallery wasn't a donation. It was an investment in her granddaughter's career, something any loving grandmother might do. 30,000 to Emma? Marcus's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Why didn't anyone tell me about that?" "I just found out. Emma probably asked her for it directly. You know how Mom is with Emma. She can't say no to her." "We need to talk to Emma," Jessica said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Make sure she understands that taking advantage of Mom's condition is inappropriate. Make sure she knows that we're watching." "Emma's not taking advantage," Richard interrupted, but his tone suggested he was defending Emma more out of obligation than conviction. "She's just naive. She doesn't understand that Mom's not thinking clearly anymore." "Still," Marcus said, his voice cold with calculation, 30,000 is 30,000. And if Emma thinks she can just ask for money whenever she wants, if she thinks she can manipulate Mom's emotions—" "I'll handle Emma," Richard said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone making a final decision. "But we need to get that power of attorney signed this week. I've scheduled another appointment with Dr. Chen. If she confirms that Mom's condition is deteriorating, we can present the legal documents as a medical necessity." Margaret's heart pounded as she listened to them plan her legal subjugation with the cold efficiency of a corporate takeover. They were going to manipulate Dr. Sarah into supporting their cause, use her supposed medical condition to justify stripping away her rights. "What if Mom refuses to sign?" Jessica asked, voicing the concern that was probably keeping all of them awake at night. "She won't," Richard said, with the confidence of someone who had never been refused anything he really wanted. "I'll explain it as a way to protect her, to make sure her wishes are followed if she becomes unable to communicate them. She trusts me. She's always trusted me." The casual confidence in his voice, the assumption that Margaret would simply hand over control of her life because he asked her to, was perhaps the most chilling thing she had heard yet. "And once we have the power of attorney?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the eager anticipation of someone discussing a profitable business deal. "Then we can start making the hard decisions, selling properties, liquidating assets, making sure her money is protected and properly managed for her care." "Protected from what?" Jessica asked. "From her," Richard said simply, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "From the poor decisions she's going to keep making as her condition gets worse. From the people who might try to take advantage of her confusion. From herself." Margaret closed her eyes and leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of betrayal settle over her like a suffocating blanket. They had convinced themselves that they were protecting her, but what they were really protecting was their inheritance. They had decided that her generosity was a symptom of mental illness, that her independence was a threat to their financial security, that her autonomy was an obstacle to their control. As she made her way back to her room, Margaret felt a profound sadness settle over her, not just for what she had lost, but for what she had never really had. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about dignity, about the fundamental question of whether her children saw her as a person or as a problem to be managed. But alongside the sadness was something else, a cold, hard determination that burned in her chest like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. They wanted to see her as incompetent. They wanted to treat her like a confused old woman who couldn't make her own decisions. Fine. She would show them exactly what a confused old woman could do when she set her mind to it. The test was far from over. In fact, Margaret was beginning to realize that it was just getting started. Her children thought they were playing chess, moving pieces around a board to achieve their desired outcome. They had no idea they were actually playing against a grandmaster who had been watching their every move, documenting their every strategy, and preparing a counterattack that would destroy them completely. Margaret Williams had built an empire by being smarter than everyone else in the room. Now, she was about to use that intelligence to teach her children the most expensive lesson of their lives. The morning of Margaret's follow-up appointment with Dr. Sarah arrived gray and overcast, the marine layer hanging low over Beverly Hills like a shroud of foreboding. Richard arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to weigh more than its contents should, and wearing his most serious expression, the one he used when closing million-dollar deals or delivering bad news to business partners. Margaret was in the breakfast nook, pretending to struggle with buttering her toast, a performance that had become second nature over the past month. She let the knife slip slightly, creating the impression of someone whose fine motor skills were beginning to fail, while actually maintaining perfect control over every movement. "Good morning, Mom," Richard said, kissing her cheek with what appeared to be genuine affection, but felt cold against her skin. "Ready for your doctor's appointment?" Margaret looked up with practiced confusion, her eyes slightly unfocused in the way she had perfected through hours of practice in front of her bedroom mirror. "Doctor's appointment? What doctor's appointment?" "Remember? Dr. Chen wants to see how you're doing, to check on your progress. We talked about this yesterday, and the day before. Did we?" Margaret blinked several times, her expression cycling through confusion and embarrassment. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't remember. Sometimes things just slip away from me." Richard's expression was patient, understanding, but Margaret caught the quick flash of satisfaction in his eyes. Her apparent memory loss was exactly what he needed to justify what he was planning. The legal documents that waited in his briefcase like loaded weapons. "That's okay, Mom. That's exactly why we're going to see the doctor. She's going to help us figure out how to take better care of you." The drive to Dr. Sarah's office was quiet, with Richard occasionally pointing out landmarks and asking if Margaret remembered them. She responded with appropriate confusion, claiming not to recognize places she had known for decades, while mentally rehearsing the conversation she'd had with Dr. Sarah the night before. "Margaret," Dr. Sarah had said during their private phone call, her voice tight with concern, "I'm not comfortable with how far this has gone. Your son has been calling my office repeatedly, asking about your prognosis, pushing for documentation of your decline." "What kind of documentation?" "The kind that would support a legal finding of incompetence. Margaret, I think he's planning to use my medical opinion to take control of your affairs. He's been asking very specific questions about your capacity to make financial decisions, your ability to live independently, your need for supervision." Margaret had felt a chill run down her spine. "Can you refuse to provide that documentation?" "I can, but it might raise suspicions. He's already asking why your condition isn't progressing as quickly as he expected. I think he's becoming suspicious of your recovery periods." They had agreed on a plan that would satisfy Richard's immediate needs while protecting Margaret's long-term interests. But it would require Margaret to give the performance of her life, to convince her own son that she was losing her mind while actually maintaining perfect control over every detail. Now, sitting in Dr. Sarah's office with Richard beside her, Margaret prepared to do exactly that. The familiar room felt different today, less like a place of healing and more like a courtroom where her fate would be decided. "How have you been feeling, Margaret?" "Doctor," Sarah asked, her voice professionally neutral, but her eyes carrying a message of support that only Margaret could read. Margaret looked around the room with apparent confusion, her gaze settling on Dr. Sarah's face as if she was trying to place a half-remembered acquaintance. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" Richard leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mom, this is Dr. Chen. Your doctor. We've been seeing her for years, remember?" "Oh," Margaret said vaguely, her voice carrying the uncertain quality of someone grasping for memories that seemed just out of reach. "Yes, of course. I'm sorry, doctor. What was your name again?" Dr. Sarah made a note on her chart, her pen moving across the paper with deliberate precision. "That's all right, Margaret. Can you tell me what day it is?" Margaret paused, looking genuinely uncertain as she searched for an answer that seemed to elude her. "It's Tuesday?" "It's Thursday, Mom," Richard said gently, but Margaret could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Thursday," Margaret repeated, her voice carrying a note of distress. "Yes, Thursday. I knew that. Sometimes the days get mixed up." For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Sarah conducted a series of cognitive tests that Margaret had researched extensively. She answered some questions correctly, missed others in ways that suggested specific types of memory loss, and occasionally became agitated when she couldn't remember something that should have been simple. "I'm sorry," Margaret said at one point, tears forming in her eyes with the skill of someone who had learned to cry on command. "I used to be so smart. I used to remember everything. I could run a company, make million-dollar decisions, keep track of hundreds of details. What's happening to me?" Richard reached over and took her hand, his touch warm but somehow lacking in genuine comfort. "It's okay, Mom. We're going to take care of you. You don't have to worry about anything anymore." But Margaret was watching his face, and what she saw there wasn't compassion. It was calculation. He was mentally cataloging every mistake she made, every sign of confusion, building his case for legal intervention with the thoroughness of a prosecutor preparing for trial. After the examination, Dr. Sarah asked to speak with Richard privately. Margaret was led to a waiting room where she sat quietly and listened through the thin walls, her hearing sharpened by decades of eavesdropping on business competitors. "I'm afraid Margaret's condition has progressed more rapidly than I initially expected," Dr. Sarah was saying, her voice carefully controlled. "The cognitive decline is becoming more pronounced, more consistent." "What does that mean, exactly?" Richard asked, his voice carrying the focused intensity of someone hearing exactly what he wanted to hear. "It means she's going to need increasing supervision and support. She shouldn't be making major financial decisions without guidance. She shouldn't be driving. She's going to need help with daily activities, with managing her medications, with basic safety." "Doctor, I've been researching power of attorney arrangements. Would you say that Margaret is still competent to make legal decisions?" There was a pause, and Margaret could imagine Dr. Sarah choosing her words carefully, walking the fine line between medical ethics and the deception they had agreed upon. "That's not really a medical determination, Mr. Williams. That's a legal question that would need to be decided by the courts or by legal professionals." "Mom, but in your medical opinion, is she capable of understanding the consequences of important decisions?" Another pause, longer this time. "I would say that Margaret's judgment is compromised. She would benefit from having someone she trusts help her navigate complex decisions. Someone who understands her values and her wishes." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what Dr. Sarah was being forced to say. Her friend was walking a careful line, providing Richard with what he needed while not actually declaring Margaret incompetent. But Richard was hearing exactly what he wanted to hear. "I've prepared some legal documents," Richard said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose plan was coming together perfectly. "Power of attorney for medical and financial decisions. Would you be willing to provide a letter stating that these arrangements are medically advisable?" I suppose I could provide a letter recommending that Margaret have assistance with major decisions, for her own protection and well-being. That would be very helpful, Doctor. Thank you." When they returned to the car, Richard was practically glowing with satisfaction, his earlier tension replaced by the confident energy of someone who had just won a crucial victory. Mom, Dr. Chen thinks it would be a good idea for someone to help you with some of your decisions. Just to make sure you don't get confused or overwhelmed, to protect you from making mistakes. Margaret looked at him with apparent gratitude, her eyes soft with the trust of someone who believed her son had her best interests at heart. That's very thoughtful, dear. Who would help me? Well, I was thinking I could do it. I know your business, I understand your finances, I've been involved in your affairs for years. I could make sure everything is handled properly, that your wishes are respected. That sounds wonderful, Margaret said, her voice carrying the relief of someone who was grateful to have such a caring son. You're such a good boy, Richard. Your father would be so proud. But as they drove home, Margaret was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about the briefcase Richard had brought with him, the one that undoubtedly contained the power of attorney documents he was so eager for her to sign. She was thinking about the conversation she had overheard, about the legal trap that was closing around her with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Most of all, she was thinking about the final phase of her test, the culmination of everything she had learned about her family's true nature. That evening, Richard suggested they have a family meeting. Just to discuss Mom's care, he told Marcus and Jessica when they arrived, their faces carrying the solemn expressions of people attending a funeral. Dr. Chen thinks we need to start making some arrangements. Emma arrived last, looking worried and tired. She had been spending more and more time at the mansion, often staying overnight to help with Margaret's care, and the strain was beginning to show. Margaret felt a pang of guilt watching her granddaughter's obvious exhaustion, but she also felt a surge of love. Emma was the only one who was there out of genuine concern rather than calculated self-interest. So, Richard began, opening his briefcase with the ceremony of someone unveiling a masterpiece. I've spoken with Dr. Chen, and she's recommended that Mom have some assistance with major decisions. Nothing dramatic, just someone to help make sure she doesn't get confused or overwhelmed. What kind of assistance? Emma asked, her voice immediately suspicious. Legal assistance. Power of attorney. It's a common arrangement for people in Mom's situation, a way to make sure she's protected and her interests are represented. Marcus nodded approvingly, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone whose investment was finally paying dividends. That makes sense. Better to have it in place before it's needed. Jessica was already looking at the documents Richard had spread on the coffee table, her eyes scanning the legal language with the intensity of someone reading a treasure map. This gives you control over everything, doesn't it? Medical decisions, financial decisions, property management. It gives me the authority to help Mom when she needs help, Richard corrected, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious. It's not about control, it's about protection. It's about making sure she doesn't make decisions that could hurt her or put her at risk. Emma picked up one of the documents and began reading, her expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. This is very broad, Dad. This would essentially make you Mom's legal guardian. This would give you the right to make decisions about where she lives, what medical care she receives, how her money is spent. Only if she becomes unable to make decisions for herself, Richard said quickly. Right now, it's just a precaution, just a safety net. Margaret watched the exchange with fascination, seeing her family's true dynamics play out in real time. Emma was asking all the right questions, raising all the appropriate concerns, fighting to protect Margaret's rights, even when it meant standing against her own father. But Marcus and Jessica were clearly on board with Richard's plan, their eyes bright with the anticipation of people who saw their financial future finally coming into focus. I think it's smart, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made up his mind. Mom's already made some questionable financial decisions. Remember that $50,000 she gave to the animal shelter? That's not like her. Since when is charity not like Grandma? Emma shot back, her voice ringing with indignation. She's been supporting causes she cares about for decades. She's always been generous, always been willing to help others. But $50,000, Emma? All at once? To an organization she'd never donated to before? That's not generosity. That's poor judgment. Margaret wanted to speak up, to defend her charitable giving, to explain that the animal shelter rescued senior dogs and that she had researched them thoroughly before making the donation. But she forced herself to remain silent, to continue the charade that was revealing so much about her family's priorities. "I think we should all take some time to think about this," Emma said finally, her voice carrying the firmness of someone who refused to be rushed into a decision. "This is a big step, and we shouldn't make it lightly." "Actually," Richard said, his voice taking on a note of urgency, "Dr. Chen recommended that we move quickly. Mom's condition could deteriorate rapidly, and if we wait too long, she might not be competent to sign the documents." Emma's eyes narrowed, and Margaret could see her granddaughter's sharp intelligence focusing on the inconsistency. "That sounds like pressure, Dad. That sounds like you're trying to rush her into signing something before she has a chance to think about it." "It's not pressure, it's medical advice. It's what's best for Mom." Margaret looked around the room at her family, seeing them with perfect clarity for perhaps the first time in her life. Richard was confident and persuasive, using his authority as the eldest son and his supposed medical backing to push through his agenda. Marcus and Jessica were nodding along with everything he said, their eyes bright with greed and anticipation. And Emma was standing alone, trying to protect Margaret's interests against her own father and aunts. Only one person in that room was focused on Margaret's well-being. Only one person seemed to care about her rights, her dignity, her autonomy. Only one person was treating her like a beloved family member rather than a problem to be solved. "I'd like to read these documents more carefully," Emma said, her voice steady despite the pressure she was facing. "And maybe Mom should have her own lawyer review them, someone who can explain what she's signing and make sure her interests are protected." "That's not necessary," Richard said quickly, his mask slipping slightly. "These are standard forms, and having another lawyer involved would just complicate things unnecessarily." "Complicate things for whom?" Emma asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret could see that Emma was outnumbered, but she wasn't backing down. Her granddaughter was willing to fight for her rights, even when it meant standing against the entire family. "Look," Richard said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I'm trying to do what's best for Mom. If you want to stand in the way of that, if you want to make this difficult—" "I want to make sure Grandma's rights are protected," Emma interrupted, her voice ringing with moral clarity. "I want to make sure she has a say in decisions about her own life. She does have a say. That's why we're asking her to sign these documents while she's still competent." Margaret realized this was her moment, the culmination of everything she had been building toward. She looked around the room with apparent confusion, then focused on Richard with the trusting expression of someone who believed her son had her best interests at heart. "What documents, dear? What are we talking about?" The room fell silent, the kind of profound quiet that follows a devastating revelation. Richard's face went pale as he realized that his mother, the woman he was trying to convince to sign over her autonomy, couldn't even remember what they had been discussing. "Mom," he said gently, his voice carrying a note of desperation, "we were just discussing some legal arrangements, to help you if you need help." "Legal arrangements?" Margaret repeated, her voice carrying the confusion of someone who was completely lost. "What kind of legal arrangements?" "Nothing for you to worry about," Jessica said quickly, her voice bright with false cheer. "Just some paperwork to make sure you're taken care of." Margaret looked at Emma, who was watching the exchange with growing alarm. "Emma," Margaret said, her voice carrying the trust of someone reaching for the one person she could count on, "what do you think I should do?" Emma knelt beside Margaret's chair and took her hands, her touch warm and reassuring. "Grandma, I think you should take your time. I think you should understand exactly what these papers mean before you sign anything." "But Richard says it's important," Margaret said, her voice carrying the confusion of someone caught between conflicting advice. "Richard says the doctor thinks I should sign them." "The doctor thinks you should have help with decisions," Emma said carefully, her voice gentle but firm. "But that doesn't mean you have to give up the right to make those decisions yourself." Margaret nodded slowly, as if trying to process this information through the fog of confusion that seemed to surround her. "I'm so confused," she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't understand what's happening to me." Richard moved to her other side, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone dealing with a difficult child. "That's exactly why we need these arrangements, Mom. So you don't have to be confused or worried. So someone you trust can handle the complicated things." Margaret looked back and forth between Richard and Emma, appearing torn and uncertain, like someone caught between two people she loved who were giving her completely different advice. "I think," she said slowly, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who was overwhelmed by decisions she couldn't understand, "I'd like to sleep on it. Can we talk about this tomorrow?" Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he managed to keep his voice calm. "Of course, Mom. Whatever you're comfortable with." But Margaret could see the frustration in his eyes, the impatience of someone whose carefully laid plans were being delayed by an inconvenient attack of conscience from his daughter and confusion from his mother. As the family dispersed, Emma lingered behind, her face creased with worry and something that looked like growing suspicion. "Grandma," she said quietly, "are you okay? Really okay?" Margaret looked into her granddaughter's eyes and saw genuine love and concern, the kind of pure emotion that couldn't be faked or manufactured. For a moment, she was tempted to tell Emma everything, to reveal the test, to explain what she had discovered about the rest of the family. But she wasn't ready yet. She needed to see how far they would go, needed to document the full extent of their betrayal before she revealed the truth. "I'm scared, sweetheart," Margaret said, which was actually true. She was scared, not of Alzheimer's, but of what her own children were capable of how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. Emma hugged her tightly, her embrace warm and protective. "I won't let anything bad happen to you, Grandma. I promise. No matter what anyone else says, no matter what anyone else wants, I'll make sure you're safe." As Margaret went to bed that night, she reflected on the day's events with the analytical mind that had built her empire. Richard had shown his hand completely. He was willing to use her supposed medical condition to manipulate her into signing away her autonomy. Marcus and Jessica were eager accomplices, their greed overriding any concern for her well-being. And Emma was the only one standing between Margaret and a complete loss of control over her own life. Tomorrow, she would give Richard what he wanted. She would sign his documents, hand over the legal control he was so desperate to obtain. But she would also set in motion the final phase of her test, the culmination of everything she had learned about her family's true nature. Because if her children thought they could manipulate a confused old woman, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Margaret Williams had spent 50 years outmaneuvering people who underestimated her, and she was about to teach her own family the most expensive lesson of their lives. The test was almost over, and justice was finally within reach. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Williams mansion, someone who would change the entire dynamic of Margaret's carefully orchestrated test. Margaret was in the garden, pretending to be confused about which flowers were which, when she heard the doorbell ring with the cheerful chime that had welcomed guests for 20 years. Through the French doors, she watched Richard answer it, then saw his face light up with a smile she hadn't seen in weeks. Genuine, warm, and completely different from the calculated expressions he had been wearing around her. "Linda, you're early. Come in, come in." Margaret's blood ran cold as she watched a woman in her 40s enter her home. Linda Morrison was attractive in a professional way, blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing scrubs that looked expensive, carrying herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. But what made Margaret's heart race was the way Richard embraced this woman. The familiarity of their interaction, the intimacy that spoke of a relationship far deeper than professional acquaintance. "Richard," Linda was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the open door, "are you sure about this? It feels deceptive." "It's not deceptive," Richard replied, his voice low but urgent, like a man trying to convince himself as much as her. "It's practical. Mom needs full-time care, and you're a registered nurse. It's perfect." Margaret's hands stilled on the roses she was pretending to tend. A registered nurse? But more than that. The tone of their conversation, the way they stood close together, the casual intimacy of their body language, told her everything she needed to know about their relationship. "But I'm not just any nurse, Richard. I'm your... I know what we are," Richard said, glancing around nervously as if he was afraid of being overheard. "But Mom doesn't need to know that. As far as she's concerned, you're Linda Morrison, RN, specializing in Alzheimer's care. Nothing more." Margaret felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Richard wasn't just bringing in a nurse to care for her, he was bringing in his mistress and disguising her as medical personnel. The audacity of it, the sheer calculated cruelty, took her breath away. "What about your family?" Linda asked, her voice carrying a note of concern. "Won't they think it's strange that you hired someone so quickly?" "I'll tell them Dr. Chen recommended you. That you specialize in early-stage Alzheimer's, that you come highly recommended. They'll be grateful that I found someone so qualified." "And Emma, your daughter seems very protective of your mother." Richard's voice hardened, taking on the cold edge that Margaret had heard more and more frequently lately. "Emma is young and idealistic. She'll adjust. And frankly, having you here will make it easier to manage Mom's care without Emma interfering." Margaret's heart pounded as the full scope of Richard's plan became clear. He wasn't just trying to take control of her finances, he was trying to isolate her from the one person who truly cared about her welfare. By bringing Linda into the house as a nurse, he could control who had access to Margaret, what information they received about her condition, and how her care was managed. "I still don't like it," Linda was saying, her voice carrying genuine reluctance. "What if someone finds out about us? What if they discover that I'm not really here as your mother's nurse?" "No one will find out. We'll be completely professional when anyone else is around. And think about it, Linda. Once I have power of attorney, once Mom's affairs are properly managed, we can be together openly. We won't have to sneak around anymore." Margaret gripped the garden shears so tightly her knuckles went white. Richard was planning his future with his mistress, while simultaneously planning to strip away Margaret's autonomy and dignity. He was using her supposed illness as cover for his own personal agenda, bringing his lover into her home under false pretenses. "All right," Linda said finally, her voice carrying the resignation of someone who had been convinced against her better judgment. "But I want to be clear. I'm doing this for you, not for the money." "Of course," Richard said, though Margaret caught the slight hesitation in his voice. "Though the salary will be generous. Very generous." As they moved deeper into the house, Margaret remained in the garden, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just witnessed. This changed everything. Richard wasn't just being greedy or impatient. He was actively conspiring to deceive her, to bring his mistress into her home under false pretenses, to use her supposed illness as cover for his own romantic and financial schemes. She needed to call Dr. Sarah immediately. "Dr. Chen," Margaret said when she reached the doctor on her cell phone, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I need to see you today. Privately. It's urgent." "Margaret, what's wrong? You sound upset." "Richard just brought his mistress to my house and introduced her as a nurse specializing in Alzheimer's care. He's planning to use her to control my environment and isolate me from Emma." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Margaret could imagine Dr. Sarah processing the implications of what she was hearing. "Margaret, this has gone too far. We need to end this charade before—" "Not yet," Margaret said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. "I need to see exactly how far he'll go, but I need your help to protect myself." "What do you need?" "I need you to document everything. Every lie Richard has told you, every pressure he's applied, every attempt to manipulate your medical opinion. I need a complete record of his deception." "Margaret." "Sarah, please. I know what I'm doing, but I need to know that when this is over, I'll have evidence of what really happened. I need to be able to prove that Richard brought his mistress into my home under false pretenses, that he lied about her credentials, that he used my supposed illness to justify his deception." Dr. Sarah sighed, the sound carrying the weight of someone who was being asked to participate in something that went against every instinct she had. "All right, but I'm setting a deadline. 1 more week, Margaret. After that, I'm ending this regardless of what you want." That afternoon, Richard gathered the family again to introduce Linda. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, playing the role of the confused patient while studying this woman who was about to become a central figure in her life. Linda was attractive in a professional way. Mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing scrubs that looked expensive and well-tailored. She spoke with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being in charge, but Margaret noticed how her eyes kept drifting to Richard, how she stood just a little closer to him than was strictly professional. "Mrs. Williams," Linda said, kneeling beside Margaret's chair with practiced grace. "I'm Linda Morrison. I'm a registered nurse, and I specialize in caring for people with Alzheimer's disease." Margaret looked at her with apparent confusion, her eyes slightly unfocused in the way she had perfected. "Alzheimer's. Do I have Alzheimer's?" "Yes, dear," Linda said gently, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had dealt with confused patients before. "But we're going to take very good care of you." Emma, who had arrived just as the introductions were beginning, stepped forward with the protective instincts that had become second nature. "I'm sorry, but who hired you? I thought we were going to discuss Mom's care as a family before making any decisions." Richard answered smoothly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had anticipated this question. "Dr. Chen recommended Linda. Given Mom's recent decline, she felt we needed professional help immediately." "I'd like to see Linda's credentials," Emma said politely but firmly, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who sensed deception. Linda smiled, her expression professional and reassuring. "Of course. I have my nursing license, my certification in geriatric care, and specialized training in Alzheimer's treatment. I can provide references from previous families I've worked with." Margaret watched this exchange with fascination. Linda was clearly prepared for scrutiny. She had all the right credentials, all the right answers. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment deception. It was a carefully planned operation that had been thought through in advance. "How long have you been working with Alzheimer's patients?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the intensity of someone conducting a job interview. "About 8 years," Linda replied smoothly. "I find it very rewarding work. Every patient is different, and it's important to adapt care to their specific needs and personality." "And what's your approach to care?" "I believe in maintaining dignity and independence for as long as possible, while ensuring safety and proper medical management. I also believe in working closely with family members to ensure everyone is comfortable with the care plan." Emma nodded, but Margaret could see the skepticism in her granddaughter's eyes. Emma's instincts were telling her something was wrong, even if she couldn't put her finger on what it was. "I'd like to spend some time with Mrs. Williams alone," Linda said, her voice carrying the professional authority that made it difficult to argue with her, "to assess her current condition and develop an appropriate care routine." "I'll stay," Emma said immediately, her protective instincts flaring. "Actually," Richard interjected, his voice carrying the smooth persuasion he had learned in business school, "I think it would be better if Linda could do her assessment without distractions. It's important that she get an accurate picture of Mom's condition." Emma's jaw tightened, and Margaret could see the frustration building in her granddaughter's eyes. "I'm not a distraction. I'm her granddaughter." "Of course you're not a distraction," Linda said smoothly, her voice carrying the practiced diplomacy of someone who had dealt with difficult family dynamics before. "But sometimes patients behave differently when family members are present. They might try to hide their confusion or put on a brave face. For an accurate assessment, it's often better to observe them in a more neutral environment." Margaret had to admit that Linda was good at this. Every answer was reasonable, every explanation plausible. If Margaret hadn't known the truth, she might have been convinced herself. "Fine," Emma said reluctantly, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "But I want a full report on Grandma's condition and the care plan you're recommending." "Absolutely," Linda agreed, her voice carrying the reassurance of someone who had nothing to hide. Transparency is essential in this kind of work. After Emma left, Linda's demeanor changed subtly. She was still professional, but there was a new authority in her voice, a sense that she was now in charge of Margaret's environment and care. "Mrs. Williams," Linda said, her voice taking on the tone of someone establishing ground rules. "I'm going to be taking care of you from now on. We're going to get along just fine, aren't we?" Margaret looked at her with apparent confusion, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who was lost and frightened. "Are you a friend of Richard's?" Linda and Richard exchanged a quick glance, and Margaret caught the flash of communication between them, the look of two people who were coordinating their story. "I'm a nurse," Linda said carefully, her voice carrying the patience of someone dealing with a confused patient. "Richard hired me to help take care of you." "That's very nice," Margaret said vaguely, her voice carrying the gratitude of someone who was grateful for any kindness. "Richard is such a good son." Over the next few days, Margaret watched as Linda systematically took control of her daily routine with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Linda prepared her meals, managed her medications, which were actually just vitamins since Margaret wasn't really sick, and monitored her activities with the thoroughness of someone who took her job seriously. More importantly, Linda controlled who had access to Margaret and when. She became the gatekeeper of Margaret's life, the filter through which all information about her condition passed. When Emma came to visit, Linda was always present, always professional, always ready with updates on Margaret's condition. "She had a difficult morning," Linda would report, her voice carrying the concerned authority of a medical professional. "Very confused, quite agitated. I think it's best if visits are kept short today." Or, "She's having trouble recognizing people today. Don't be upset if she doesn't seem to know you." Margaret watched Emma's growing frustration and concern with a mixture of pride and guilt. Her granddaughter was being systematically shut out of her care, fed a steady diet of alarming reports about her deteriorating condition. But the most disturbing part was what happened when Emma wasn't there. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Linda thought Margaret was asleep, Margaret would hear Richard and Linda talking in low voices in the kitchen or the study. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of them embracing in the hallway, their professional facade dropping when they thought no one was watching. "How much longer do we have to keep this up?" Linda asked one night, her voice carrying through the thin walls with the clarity of someone who thought she was being discreet. "Not much longer," Richard replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose plan was proceeding perfectly. "I'm meeting with the lawyer tomorrow to finalize the power of attorney. Once that's signed, we can start making the necessary changes. What about Emma? She's getting suspicious." "Emma's not a problem. She's young. She has her own life. Once we have legal authority, her opinions won't matter." Margaret felt sick. They were talking about her granddaughter, the one person who truly loved her, like she was an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved. "And after that?" Linda asked, her voice carrying the anticipation of someone looking forward to a better future. "After that, we can start planning our future. Together." Margaret closed her eyes and tried to process what she was hearing. Richard wasn't just stealing her money and her autonomy. He was stealing her life, her relationships, her dignity. He was turning her into a prisoner in her own home, cared for by his mistress, isolated from the people who loved her. The next morning, Richard approached Margaret with the power of attorney documents again, his briefcase open on the coffee table like a lawyer preparing for a crucial case. "Mom," he said gently, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone who knew he was about to get what he wanted. "I really think we should take care of this paperwork today." Linda agrees that it's important to have these arrangements in place. Margaret looked at the documents with apparent confusion, her eyes moving across the legal language as if she was trying to read a foreign language. "What are these papers, dear?" "They're just legal forms that will let me help you if you get confused or can't make decisions for yourself. It's for your protection, Mom. It's to make sure you're always taken care of." "Linda thinks I should sign them?" "Linda thinks it's very important," Richard confirmed, his voice carrying the authority of medical backing. "She's seen what happens to patients who don't have these arrangements in place. It can be very difficult for families." Margaret nodded slowly, as if trying to process this information through the fog of confusion that seemed to surround her. "If you think it's best." "I do, Mom. I really do." Margaret picked up the pen with shaking hands, not from any medical condition, but from the sheer emotional weight of what she was about to do. She was about to sign away her legal rights to a son who had brought his mistress into her home, who was systematically isolating her from her granddaughter, who was planning to use her supposed illness to steal her life. but she was also about to give him exactly enough rope to hang himself. "Where do I sign?" she asked, her voice carrying the trust of someone who believed her son had her best interests at heart. Richard's face lit up with triumph, the expression of someone who had just won the most important victory of his life. "Right here, Mom, and here, and initial here." As Margaret signed each document, she was mentally preparing for the final phase of her test. Richard thought he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated a confused old woman into giving him everything he wanted. He had no idea that the confused old woman was actually a brilliant businesswoman who had been documenting his every move, recording his every lie, building a case that would destroy him completely. The power of attorney was signed. Richard now had legal control over Margaret's life. But Margaret Williams was about to show him exactly what a mistake that was. With the power of attorney documents signed and filed, Richard's transformation was swift and dramatic, like a mask being removed to reveal the true face beneath. Within days, he had moved into Margaret's study, installed himself behind her mahogany desk, and begun making decisions about her life with the confidence of someone who believed he was now in complete control. Margaret watched it all from her new position as the managed patient, and what she saw was breathtaking in its audacity and chilling in its calculation. The first major change came on a Tuesday morning when the autumn light filtered through the windows with golden warmth that should have been comforting. Margaret was sitting in the sunroom, pretending to struggle with a simple jigsaw puzzle, when Richard and Linda entered with the serious expressions of people about to deliver important news. "Mom," Richard said, settling into the chair across from her with the authority of someone who no longer needed to ask permission. "Linda and I have been discussing your care, and we think it would be best if you had fewer visitors for a while." Margaret looked up with apparent confusion, her hands pausing over the puzzle pieces. "Fewer visitors?" "You've been getting agitated lately," Linda explained, her voice carrying the professional authority that made it difficult to argue with her assessment. "Too much stimulation can be overwhelming for someone in your condition. We think it would be better if you had a quieter, more controlled environment." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who was afraid of the answer. "It means," Richard said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child, "that we're going to limit visits to immediate family only. And even then, only when Linda thinks you're having a good day." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, the cold realization of what was happening settling over her like a shroud. "What about Emma? She visits me every day." "Emma can still visit," Richard said quickly, but Margaret could hear the calculation in his voice. "But maybe not every day. Maybe just on weekends, when you're more rested." Margaret understood immediately what was happening. They were isolating her from Emma, the one person who might question their version of events, who might notice inconsistencies in Margaret's supposed condition, who might fight for her rights. "I like it when Emma visits," Margaret said, allowing a note of distress to enter her voice. "She makes me feel better. She makes me feel less confused." "I know, Mom," Richard said, his tone patronizing in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "But sometimes what makes us feel good isn't what's best for us. Linda knows what's best for your health." Over the next few days, Margaret watched as her world systematically shrank with the precision of a carefully executed plan. Phone calls were screened by Linda, who would tell callers that Margaret was having a difficult day or not up for conversation. Mail was intercepted and sorted by Richard, who claimed he was protecting her from confusing correspondence that might upset her. When Emma tried to visit on Wednesday, Linda met her at the door with a concerned expression that looked genuine, but felt calculated. "I'm sorry, Emma, but your grandmother is having a very bad day. She's been confused and agitated all morning. I think it would be better if you came back this weekend." Margaret, watching from the living room window, saw Emma's face fall with the devastation of someone who was being shut out from the person she loved most. Her granddaughter stood on the doorstep for a long moment, clearly wanting to argue, but Linda's professional authority was difficult to challenge. "Is she okay?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the worry of someone who sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify what it was. "Should we call Dr. Chen?" "I've already spoken with Dr. Chen," Linda lied smoothly, her voice carrying the reassurance of someone who had everything under control. She agrees that we need to minimize stimulation during these difficult periods. Your grandmother will be fine, but she needs rest. Margaret wanted to run to the door, to tell Emma that it was all lies, that she was fine and desperately wanted to see her. But she forced herself to remain still, to continue the charade that was revealing so much about her family's true nature. That evening, Margaret overheard a conversation that made her blood boil with rage so intense she had to grip the arms of her chair to keep from shaking. The Emma situation is becoming a problem, Linda was telling Richard, as they sat in the study that had once been Margaret's sanctuary. She's too observant, too protective. She's going to start asking questions we can't answer. What kind of questions? Medical questions. She's been researching Alzheimer's online, learning about symptoms and progression. Yesterday she asked me about your mother's medication regimen. She wanted to know why we weren't trying any of the new treatments she'd read about. Richard frowned, his expression carrying the concern of someone whose carefully laid plans were being threatened. What did you tell her? I told her that every patient is different, that we're taking a conservative approach. But she's not satisfied with that answer. She wants to talk to Dr. Chen directly. That can't happen, Richard said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone making a non-negotiable decision. Dr. Chen might say something that contradicts our assessment. Exactly. So we need to find a way to limit Emma's involvement even further. Margaret listened in horror as they discussed strategies for keeping Emma away. They talked about telling her that her visits were upsetting to Margaret, about suggesting that she was in denial about her grandmother's condition, about gradually convincing the family that Emma's protective instincts were actually harmful to Margaret's health. But the conversation that truly broke Margaret's heart came the next night, when she overheard Richard discussing the long-term plan with Linda. I've been thinking about what happens when Mom gets worse, Richard was saying, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing a business strategy. About what happens when people expect her condition to progress. What do you mean? Linda asked. I mean, we can't keep this up indefinitely. Eventually, people are going to expect her to need more intensive care. They're going to expect her to become more confused, more dependent. Are you talking about a nursing home? I'm talking about options. There are some very nice facilities, very expensive, very private. The kind of place where families can visit when it's convenient, where professional staff handle all the day-to-day care. Margaret felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Richard was planning to institutionalize her, to put her away somewhere where he could control access to her completely. But she's not that bad yet, Linda protested, and Margaret could hear genuine concern in her voice. She's confused, but she's not completely incapacitated. Not yet, Richard agreed, his voice carrying the cold calculation of someone planning several moves ahead. But Alzheimer's is progressive. In 6 months, a year, she could be much worse. We need to start preparing for that possibility. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we make sure her affairs are properly managed. I've already started reviewing her investment portfolio. Some of her holdings are questionable, too risky for someone in her condition. Margaret knew exactly what that meant. Richard was planning to liquidate her carefully chosen investments and move the money into accounts he could control more easily. What about the real estate? Linda asked. The Malibu house is definitely going to be sold. She's never going to use it again, and it's just sitting there generating expenses. The art collection probably needs to be liquidated too. It's not practical to maintain in a care facility. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to control her rage. They were dismantling her life piece by piece, selling off everything she and Robert had built together, and they were doing it all under the guise of caring for her. But the final straw came the next morning, when Margaret overheard Richard on the phone with someone he called the estate planning attorney. Yes, I understand the legal requirements, Richard was saying, his voice carrying the impatience of someone who didn't want to be lectured about ethics. But you have to understand, my mother's condition is deteriorating rapidly. We need to make sure her assets are protected before she becomes completely incompetent. There was a pause, then Richard continued. What do you mean, suspicious? This is a standard power of attorney arrangement. I'm her son. I'm acting in her best interests. Another pause. Look, I don't care what it looks like. My mother has Alzheimer's. She's not capable of managing a billion-dollar estate, and I'm not going to stand by and watch her give it all away to animal shelters and art galleries. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Richard was talking to lawyers about restructuring her estate, about protecting her assets from her own incompetent decisions. The granddaughter is not a factor, Richard was saying, his voice cold with dismissal. She's young, she's emotional, she doesn't understand the legal realities. Once we have the estate properly structured, her opinions won't matter. That was it. That was the moment Margaret knew she had heard enough. Richard had revealed himself completely. He had brought his mistress into her home under false pretenses. He had systematically isolated her from the people who loved her. He had lied to doctors, lawyers, and family members. He was planning to sell her most treasured possessions and institutionalize her in a private facility where he could control every aspect of her life. And he was doing it all while telling himself and everyone else that he was protecting her. Margaret had seen enough. She had learned everything she needed to know about her son's character, about his priorities, about his willingness to betray her trust for his own benefit. It was time to end the charade. But first, she needed to make sure Emma was safe. Because if Richard was willing to go this far to control Margaret, there was no telling what he might do to silence the one person who was asking inconvenient questions. That night, Margaret did something she hadn't done in weeks. She picked up her phone and made a call. "Dr. Sarah, it's Margaret. I need to see you tomorrow, alone, and I need you to bring everything, all your notes, all your records, everything Richard has said to you." "Margaret, what's wrong? You sound different." "I sound like myself," Margaret said firmly, her voice carrying the authority that had built an empire. "Because starting tomorrow, I'm going to be myself again. And Richard Williams is about to learn exactly what happens when you try to steal from a woman who built an empire." The test was over. Margaret had learned everything she needed to know. Now it was time for justice. The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in over a month. She got dressed in one of her best business suits, applied her makeup with precision, and styled her hair the way she had when she was running board meetings. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not a confused, elderly patient, but the formidable businesswoman who had built a $2 billion empire from nothing. It was time to reclaim her life. Linda was in the kitchen preparing what she called Margaret's special breakfast, bland oatmeal and weak tea that was supposedly easier for Alzheimer's patients to digest. Margaret walked in and sat down at the breakfast table with the bearing of someone who owned the house, which she did. "Good morning, Linda," Margaret said, her voice clear and strong, carrying none of the confusion that had characterized her speech for weeks. Linda looked up, startled by the change in Margaret's tone and demeanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams. How are you feeling today?" "I'm feeling like myself for the first time in weeks," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the steel that had intimidated corporate rivals for decades. "Tell me, Linda, how long have you been sleeping with my son?" Linda dropped the spoon she was holding. It clattered against the stove and fell to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. I don't know what you mean," Linda stammered, her professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Of course you do," Margaret said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 50 years reading people's lies. "You've been having an affair with Richard for months, probably years. He brought you into my home under the pretense of being my nurse, but you're actually his mistress. The question is, are you a willing participant in this fraud, or are you just another one of his victims?" Linda's face had gone completely white, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Mrs. Williams, I think you're confused." "I'm not confused, Linda. I haven't been confused for a single day since this charade began. I've been testing my family, and unfortunately, they've all failed spectacularly." Before Linda could respond, Richard walked into the kitchen, already dressed for work. He stopped short when he saw Margaret sitting upright, alert, and clearly in command of herself. "Mom, you look different today." "I look like myself, Richard, because I am myself. I've always been myself." Richard's eyes darted between Margaret and Linda, clearly sensing that something had shifted dramatically, but not understanding what. I don't understand, he said slowly. Then let me explain, Margaret said, standing up and walking to the kitchen island where she had hidden a small recording device weeks ago. I've been recording everything, Richard. Every conversation, every lie, every moment of betrayal. She pressed play, and Richard's voice filled the kitchen. Once I have power of attorney, once Mom's affairs are properly managed, we can be together openly. We won't have to sneak around anymore. Richard's face went ashen as he heard his own words played back to him. Mom, I can explain. Can you? Margaret asked, pressing play again. This time it was Linda's voice. How much longer do we have to keep this up? And Richard's response, not much longer. I'm meeting with the lawyer tomorrow to finalize the power of attorney. Once that's signed, we can start making the necessary changes. Linda sank into a chair, her professional composure completely shattered. You see, Margaret continued, her voice carrying the cold precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. I never had Alzheimer's. I never had any cognitive decline at all. Doctor, Chen and I staged the entire thing because I suspected that my children were more interested in my money than my well-being. And unfortunately, I was right. Richard was staring at her in shock, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. You faked it? All of it? Every symptom, every moment of confusion, every sign of decline. I wanted to see who would stand by me when I was vulnerable, and who would see my vulnerability as an opportunity. Margaret walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a thick folder. I have documentation of everything, Richard. Your lies to Dr. Chen, your pressure for power of attorney, your plans to sell my properties, your discussions about putting me in a nursing home, your conspiracy to isolate me from Emma. She opened the folder and spread out photographs, transcripts, and legal documents. I also have evidence of your financial improprieties. Did you think I wouldn't notice that you've been skimming money from the company accounts, that you've been using corporate funds for personal expenses? Richard's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. And Linda. Margaret turned to the woman who was still sitting in stunned silence. I have recordings of you participating in medical fraud. You represented yourself as my nurse while conducting an affair with my son. You lied to my family about my condition. You helped isolate me from my granddaughter. That's not just unethical, it's criminal. Linda found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Mrs. Williams, please, I never meant— You never meant to get caught, Margaret interrupted. But you absolutely meant to deceive me, to manipulate me, to help Richard steal my life. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Margaret looked at her son, this man she had raised, educated, loved, and trusted, and felt a profound sadness settle over her. Richard, she said quietly, I gave you everything. I gave you the best education money could buy. I gave you opportunities, resources, love, support. I trusted you with my business, my finances, my life. And the moment you thought I was vulnerable, you tried to steal it all. Mom, please, let me explain. Explain what? Explain how you brought your mistress into my home and disguised her as medical personnel? Explain how you lied to doctors to get the medical documentation you needed? Explain how you planned to sell the house where your father and I fell in love? Explain how you were going to put me in an institution so you could control my money without the inconvenience of actually caring for me? Richard's face crumpled, the mask of confident authority finally, falling away completely. I thought I was protecting you. You thought you were protecting yourself, Margaret corrected. You were protecting your inheritance, your future, your relationship with Linda. You weren't protecting me. You were stealing from me. Just then, Emma's voice came from the front hallway. Grandma, are you okay? Linda said you were having a bad day, but I was worried. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped short, taking in the scene. Margaret standing tall and alert, Linda sitting in obvious distress, Richard looking like he'd seen a ghost. Grandma? Emma said uncertainly. You look like yourself. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in weeks. I am myself, sweetheart. I've always been myself. Emma's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. You mean you're not sick? I'm not sick. I never was sick. I was testing our family to see who would love me when I was vulnerable and who would see my vulnerability as an opportunity to take advantage of me. Emma looked around the kitchen, her gaze settling on Linda. And she's not really a nurse? She's a nurse, Margaret said. But she's not my nurse. She's your father's mistress. Emma's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, realization, anger, and finally a cold fury that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. "Dad," Emma said, her voice deadly quiet. "What have you done?" Richard tried to speak, but Emma cut him off. "You brought your girlfriend into Grandma's house? You made me think she was dying? You made me worry, made me cry, made me think I was losing the most important person in my life. All so you could— What? Steal her money?" "Emma, it's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," Emma shouted, her voice ringing with moral outrage. "You're a liar and a thief and a fraud." Margaret watched her granddaughter's righteous anger and felt a surge of pride. Emma's moral compass was true, her loyalty was genuine, and her love was unconditional. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "there's something else you need to know." She handed Emma the folder of evidence. "Your father has been embezzling money from the company. He's been using corporate funds for personal expenses, including paying Linda's salary as my nurse." Emma flipped through the documents, her face growing paler with each page. "Dad, this is millions of dollars." "I was going to pay it back," Richard said desperately. "Once Mom's estate was properly managed, once we had control of the finances." "You were going to pay it back with Grandma's money?" Emma asked incredulously. "You were going to steal from her to cover up the fact that you'd already stolen from her?" Margaret walked to the kitchen phone and picked up the receiver. "I'm calling the police," she announced, "and my lawyers, and the board of directors." "Mom, please," Richard begged, his voice breaking. "Think about what this will do to the family. Think about the scandal." Margaret paused, her finger hovering over the phone buttons. "You're right, Richard. I should think about the family. I should think about Emma, who has shown me nothing but love and loyalty. I should think about the employees who depend on our company for their livelihoods. I should think about the charities and causes that benefit from our foundation." She began dialing. "What I shouldn't think about is protecting a son who is willing to destroy all of that for his own selfish gain." As Margaret spoke to the police, then to her lawyers, then to the head of corporate security, Richard and Linda sat in stunned silence. Their carefully constructed plan had collapsed in a matter of minutes, and they were facing not just the loss of their scheme, but potential criminal charges. Emma stood beside Margaret, her hand on her grandmother's shoulder, providing the support and love that had sustained Margaret through the darkest moments of her test. "Grandma," Emma said quietly, "I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I'm sorry you had to find out what Dad really is." Margaret covered Emma's hand with her own. "I'm not sorry, sweetheart. I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I learned the truth while I still had the power to do something about it. And I'm grateful that I learned who I can really count on." She looked at Emma with tears in her eyes. "You never wavered, Emma. You never stopped loving me, never stopped protecting me, never stopped fighting for my rights and dignity. You are the daughter I should have had." As the police arrived and began taking statements, as lawyers began discussing charges and legal remedies, as the carefully ordered world of the Williams family began to crumble and reshape itself, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months: peace. The test was over, the truth was revealed, and justice was finally within reach. Richard would face the consequences of his actions. Linda would lose her nursing license and likely face criminal charges. Marcus and Jessica would have to learn to live within their means and earn their own way. But Emma would inherit not just wealth, but wisdom. Not just money, but meaning. Not just a business empire, but a moral foundation that would guide her for the rest of her life. Margaret Williams had built many things in her 72 years. But perhaps the most important thing she had built was the character of the young woman standing beside her, the granddaughter who had passed the ultimate test of love and loyalty. The empire would survive, the family would endure, and the truth would always eventually prevail. 1 year later, the boardroom of Williams Real Estate Holdings had never looked more impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of downtown Los Angeles, and the polished mahogany table reflected the faces of 12 board members who represented some of the most successful business minds in the country. At the head of the table sat Emma Williams, now 29, and bearing the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her position through merit rather than inheritance. Beside her, in the chair she had occupied for over 4 decades, sat Margaret Williams, no longer the CEO, but now Chairman Emeritus and Emma's most trusted advisor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma said, calling the quarterly board meeting to order, "I'm pleased to report that Williams Real Estate Holdings has had its most profitable year in company history." The numbers on the presentation screen were indeed impressive. Under Emma's leadership, with Margaret's guidance, the company had expanded into sustainable development, affordable housing initiatives, and green building technologies. Profits were up 37%. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and the company had won numerous awards for corporate responsibility. "The Malibu Sustainable Living Project broke ground last month," Emma continued, "and we're already seeing interest from other coastal communities who want to replicate our model. The Affordable Housing Initiative in East LA is ahead of schedule and under budget. And our partnership with the Children's Hospital has resulted in the construction of 3 new family housing facilities." Margaret watched her granddaughter with immense pride. Emma had not only proven herself capable of running the business, she had transformed it into something even better than Margaret and Robert had originally envisioned. After the meeting, as the board members filed out with congratulations and handshakes, Margaret and Emma found themselves alone in the boardroom. "Your grandfather would be so proud," Margaret said, gathering her papers. "I hope so," Emma replied. "Sometimes I still feel like I'm playing dress-up in a grown-up's job." "That feeling never completely goes away," Margaret assured her. "The day you stop questioning yourself is the day you stop growing." They walked together toward the elevator, past the wall of family photos that chronicled the company's history. There were pictures of Robert and Margaret breaking ground on their first development, celebrating their first $1 million sale, accepting awards and recognition over the decades. But there were also newer photos: Emma at the ribbon cutting for the Affordable Housing Project, Margaret and Emma together at the company's 50th anniversary celebration, the entire staff at the annual charity fundraiser that had raised over $10 million for local causes. "Grandma," Emma said as they waited for the elevator, "have you heard anything about Dad?" Margaret's expression grew somber. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Linda got 5 years. They'll both be eligible for parole in about 3 years if they demonstrate good behavior. "Do you ever think about visiting him?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think about it, but I'm not ready yet. Maybe someday, when he's had time to truly understand what he did and why it was wrong." The elevator arrived, and as they descended toward the parking garage, Emma asked the question that had been weighing on her mind for months. "Do you ever regret it? The test, I mean. Do you ever wish you hadn't found out the truth?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I regret that the truth was what it was. I regret that my son chose greed over love, manipulation over honesty. But I don't regret learning the truth while I still had the power to do something about it." "What about Marcus and Jessica? Do you think they've learned anything?" Margaret smiled slightly. "Marcus has actually done quite well for himself. Losing his inheritance forced him to develop his own business skills. He started a consulting firm that's becoming quite successful. I think the experience taught him the value of earning his own way." "And Jessica?" "Jessica has been more challenging. She's still angry about the will, still convinced that she was treated unfairly. But she's also been forced to live within her means for the first time in her life. It may take longer, but I believe she'll eventually understand why I made the choices I did." They reached Margaret's car, a modest sedan that was a far cry from the luxury vehicles she could easily afford. Since the events of the previous year, Margaret had chosen to live more simply, focusing on experiences and relationships rather than material possessions. "Emma," Margaret said, "there's something I want to discuss with you." "What is it?" "I've been thinking about the future. About what happens when I'm no longer here to guide you." Emma's face fell. "Grandma, you're only 73. You're in perfect health. You're going to be around for a long time." "I hope so, but I also want to make sure you're prepared for anything, which is why I've been working on something special." Margaret reached into her briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "This contains everything I've learned in 50 years of business. Every mistake I made, every lesson I learned, every piece of wisdom your grandfather shared with me. I want you to have it." Emma took the journal with reverence, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "But more than that," Margaret continued, "I want you to promise me something. Anything. I want you to promise that you'll never forget the lesson of this past year, that you'll never take loyalty for granted, never assume that family means the same thing to everyone, and never be afraid to test the people around you when the stakes are high enough." Emma nodded solemnly. "I promise. And I want you to promise that when your time comes, when you're facing the end of your life or your career, you'll make sure that everything we've built goes to someone who truly deserves it. Someone who will use it wisely and responsibly. I promise that too." Margaret hugged her granddaughter tightly. "Then I can rest easy knowing that the Williams legacy is in the right hands." As Margaret drove home to her mansion, now a place of peace rather than deception, she reflected on the events of the past year. The criminal trials had been difficult, the media attention overwhelming at times, and the family relationships complicated and painful. But she had also received thousands of letters from elderly people around the country who had been inspired by her story. Support groups for elder abuse victims had invited her to speak. Legislation had been introduced in several states to strengthen protections for vulnerable adults. Most importantly, she had discovered that she had raised at least one family member who truly understood the values she and Robert had tried to instill. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, looking through photo albums and remembering the journey that had brought her to this point. There were pictures of her and Robert as young entrepreneurs, full of dreams and determination. Pictures of their children as babies, toddlers, teenagers, back when she still believed that love and good intentions were enough to guarantee good character. And there were newer pictures. Emma graduating from college, Emma's first day at the company, Emma accepting her first business award. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting her reminiscences. "Hello? Mrs. Williams? This is Detective Santos. I wanted to let you know that Richard's appeal was denied. His conviction stands." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for her son, relief that justice had been served, and a strange sense of closure. "Thank you for letting me know, Detective." "Mrs. Williams, I also wanted to tell you something else. Your case has become a training example at the police academy. We're using it to teach officers how to recognize and investigate elder abuse. Your courage in coming forward has helped us develop better protocols for protecting vulnerable adults." After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly in her study, processing this information. Her personal test of family loyalty had become something larger, a catalyst for change, a source of protection for others who might face similar situations. She thought about Robert, about what he would have said about everything that had happened. She could almost hear his voice. "Margaret, you did what you had to do. You protected yourself, you protected the business, and you protected the future. That's what leaders do." A soft knock on the study door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Emma appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might like some company," Emma said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. "Always," Margaret replied, accepting the tea gratefully. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, grandmother and granddaughter, mentor and protégé, 2 women who had been through a trial by fire and emerged stronger for it. "Grandma," Emma said finally, "do you think Dad will ever understand what he did wrong?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I hope so, sweetheart. I hope that prison gives him time to reflect, to understand that love isn't about what you can get from someone, but what you're willing to give to them. And if he doesn't, then that's his choice to make. I can't control his character, Emma. I can only control my own actions and decisions." Emma nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. I love you, Grandma, she said simply. I love you too, Emma, more than you'll ever know. As the evening grew late and Emma prepared to leave, Margaret felt a profound sense of contentment. The test was over, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. But more than that, she had discovered something precious, a family member who truly understood the meaning of love, loyalty, and responsibility. The Williams empire would continue to grow and prosper under Emma's leadership. The family foundation would continue to support worthy causes. And the lessons learned from this difficult year would guide future generations in making better choices. Margaret Williams had built many things in her lifetime: buildings, businesses, wealth, and influence. But perhaps her greatest achievement was the character of the young woman who would carry on her legacy. The test of a lifetime was complete, and love, in the end, had triumphed over greed. 5 years later, the Williams Foundation's annual gala was held in the ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel, with over 500 guests representing the cream of Los Angeles society, business leaders, and philanthropists. The theme of this year's event was Building Futures, and the foundation had raised over $20 million for educational initiatives, elder care programs, and affordable housing projects. Margaret Williams, now 77 and still sharp as ever, sat at the head table watching her granddaughter address the crowd. Emma, at 34, had grown into a formidable leader in her own right, respected not just for her business acumen, but for her commitment to social responsibility. 5 years ago, Emma was saying from the podium, my grandmother taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. She taught me that true character is revealed not in times of comfort and prosperity, but in times of vulnerability and challenge. Margaret smiled, remembering that difficult year when everything had changed. She showed me that love is not about what we can take from others, but what we're willing to give. That family is not defined by blood alone, but by loyalty, respect, and genuine care for one another's well-being. In the audience, Margaret spotted several familiar faces. Dr. Sarah Chen was there with her family, still serving as the foundation's medical advisor. Detective Maria Santos, now retired, served on the board of the Elder Abuse Prevention Program that the foundation had established. Tonight, Emma continued, I'm proud to announce the opening of the Margaret Williams Center for Elder Advocacy, a facility that will provide legal, medical, and social services to elderly individuals who may be facing abuse, neglect, or exploitation. The applause was thunderous. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the video presentation about the new center, a beautiful facility that would serve as a beacon of hope for vulnerable seniors throughout Southern California. After the formal program ended and the guests began to mingle, Margaret found herself approached by a young woman she didn't recognize. Mrs. Williams? The woman said nervously. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to thank you personally. Thank me for what, dear? My name is Sarah Martinez. 2 years ago, my family tried to have my grandmother declared incompetent so they could take control of her finances. But my grandmother had read about your story in the newspaper. She knew what to look for, what questions to ask. She was able to protect herself because of what you went through. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. How is your grandmother now? She's doing wonderfully. She moved in with me, and we've become closer than ever. She always says that you saved her life by showing her that she didn't have to be a victim. As Sarah walked away, Margaret reflected on how many similar conversations she'd had over the past 5 years. Her story had inspired legislation in 12 states, led to the creation of elder advocacy programs across the country, and given countless families the tools to recognize and prevent abuse. Emma appeared at her side, having finished her hosting duties for the evening. How are you feeling, Grandma? Not too tired? I'm feeling grateful, Margaret replied. Grateful for the journey we've been on, grateful for the lessons we've learned, and grateful for the difference we've been able to make. They walked together toward the hotel's garden terrace, where the evening air was cool and fragrant with jasmine. Emma, Margaret said, I have something to tell you. Emma looked concerned. What is it? I've been thinking about stepping back from the foundation board, not retiring completely, but letting you take full leadership. Grandma, you don't need to. Yes, I do. You're ready, Emma. You've been ready for a while now. And I want to spend my remaining years knowing that everything we've built is in the hands of someone who truly understands its purpose. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this news. "What will you do?" she asked finally. Margaret smiled. "I'm going to travel. I'm going to write my memoirs. I'm going to spend time with friends and enjoy the simple pleasures I've been too busy to appreciate. And I'm going to watch with pride as you continue to build on everything your grandfather and I started." "What about Dad?" Emma asked quietly. "He's eligible for parole next year." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that too. I think I'm ready to see him. Not to reconcile completely, but to give him a chance to show me who he's become during his time in prison." "Do you think he's changed?" "I don't know. But I think everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even if they have to earn it." They stood in comfortable silence, looking out over the city lights of Los Angeles. Somewhere out there were the buildings they had constructed, the families they had housed, the communities they had strengthened. "Grandma," Emma said, "I want you to know that everything I've accomplished, everything I've learned, I owe to you." "No, sweetheart, you owe it to yourself. I may have taught you the lessons, but you chose to learn them. You chose to apply them. You chose to become the person you are today." Margaret took Emma's hand. "And that person is someone I'm incredibly proud to call my granddaughter." As they prepared to leave the gala, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with suspicion and fear, with a test born out of necessity and desperation. But it had led to something beautiful, a deeper understanding of what family really meant, a stronger foundation for the future, and a legacy that would continue to make a difference long after she was gone. The test of a lifetime had revealed painful truths about some family members, but it had also revealed beautiful truths about others. It had shown that love, when it's genuine, can survive any challenge. That integrity, when it's real, can withstand any pressure. And that family, when it's built on the right foundation, can endure anything. Margaret Williams had spent her life building an empire. But her greatest achievement was not measured in dollars or properties or business success. Her greatest achievement was the character of the young woman beside her, a woman who would carry forward not just wealth, but wisdom, not just power, but purpose, not just a business, but a mission to make the world a better place. The test was over, the lesson was learned, and the legacy would continue for generations to come. As their car pulled away from the hotel, Margaret looked back one last time at the glittering ballroom, where 500 people had gathered to support causes that mattered, to celebrate achievements that had meaning, and to commit to a future built on the values of compassion, integrity, and genuine care for others. It had been a test of a lifetime, but it had also been the foundation for a lifetime of purpose. And that, Margaret thought with deep satisfaction, was the most valuable inheritance of all.